Tonight we're unlocking a door most people will never even see, a door tucked beneath the marble and gold of Vatican City. Behind it, centuries of sealed parchment, faded ink, and silence thick enough to weigh down a soul. This isn't a conspiracy tale. It's something older, quieter, and stranger. The Vatican archives aren't just records. They're memories the world wasn't meant to hold. Stories of whispered absolutions, forgotten saints, and paintings that saw too much. Some truths were hidden to protect the faithful, others to protect the Church itself. If you find yourself drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between faith and power, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. Now, settle in. Let the world quiet around you. We're going deep beneath the surface, into the silence that remembers everything. There is a door in Rome that does not appear on any map, a door not marked by symbols or statues. It sits in the shadow of St. Peter's Dome, unremarkable in its appearance, and yet it is perhaps the most carefully watched threshold in Vatican City. Behind it lies a place built not for display, but for concealment. Beneath the marble courtyards and sunlit squares is a different Vatican, one that few will ever see. It is a labyrinth of shelves and sealed chambers, lined with documents older than some nations, and quieter than any chapel. These are not museum pieces. They are memories, paper-bound, dust-covered, and often unsigned. You will find no crowds, no plaques, no tour guides here, just time, sleeping in boxes labeled in Latin, handwritten in careful ink, and locked behind 3 layers of iron and trust. This is where the Vatican keeps what it does not forget, and it does not forget anything. The name of this place often sparks curiosity, the Vatican's secret archives. But the word secret here is a misreading. Secretum in Latin meant personal, private, belonging to the Pope himself. It was never meant to suggest scandal. And yet, over time, the privacy of these archives has become one of the Church's most misunderstood qualities. What began as a way to preserve sensitive communications and religious decisions quietly turned into a vault for some of the most controversial and consequential records in Western history. Popes wrote not only to saints and scholars, but to emperors, generals, heretics, and spies. Each letter placed inside this archive added another thread to a web of power, belief, and survival. And as the years passed, those threads tangled. Some still haven't been unraveled. I didn't enter this place as a historian or a theologian. I came as a caretaker. I was there to clean the hallways and deliver marked folders to researchers with far more credentials than I had. But sometimes, after hours, when the corridors fell silent and the lamps glowed low, I lingered. I ran my fingers along the cabinets, not opening them, just feeling their quiet weight. Then one evening, a drawer was left open, just slightly. Inside was a folder with no catalog code, no seal, no name. Only a handwritten note clipped to the front that read, "This is not for history yet." It was the first time I realized the Church doesn't hide things to erase them. Sometimes it hides things to wait, and I could not help but wonder what else was waiting. The Vatican is a city of symbols, but the archives beneath it are a city of absences. There are no stained glass windows in these halls, no incense, no singing, no echoes. The air hangs with a kind of stillness that feels earned, as though silence were something collected over centuries and stored with as much care as scripture. These rooms are lined not with relics, but with decisions. Decisions that shaped kingdoms, silenced movements, forgave sins, or refused to. One shelf might hold a papal blessing for a monarch who changed the face of Europe. Another, a letter never sent, one that could have prevented a war. These archives are not merely storage. They are the Vatican's memory, and memory, when organized by power, is never neutral. That is what struck me the most in those early days. Not the holiness of the place, but its restraint. Here was a church that remembered everything, but chose very carefully what to speak of. Some documents are catalogued, available to scholars, carefully guarded but known. But others exist only in whispers, folders with faded ink and missing signatures, pages whose dates have been scrubbed or altered. I remember once finding a single parchment folded in fourths and tucked between two completely unrelated files. It bore no heading, no salutation, just a few lines in careful Latin, warning against a vision too dangerous to be recognized. It wasn't labeled a forgery. It wasn't discarded. It was simply shelved, preserved, but untouched. This, I came to learn, was not unusual. The archive does not destroy. It absorbs. It collects things that cannot yet be understood or permitted, and then it waits, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. I began to understand that the Church does not fear history. It fears what happens when history becomes uncontrollable, and so it stores what cannot yet be faced. There are records of saints whose canonization stalled because of rumors that would never go away. There are transcripts of theological debates that ended not with conclusions, but with silence. The deeper you go, the more it feels like walking into the shadow side of belief. Not heresy, not blasphemy, just the parts of faith too complicated to be reduced to doctrine. One night I stood in a hall where no electric lights were allowed, only a lamp and the quiet sound of turning pages. I watched as a scholar beside me read, eyes wide but lips sealed. She looked up once and whispered, "They never wanted this known." I never asked what she found. I knew better. In this place, even truth has to earn its release. Not everything in the archive is paper. Some items are made of wood, wax, canvas, or even ash. In one locked drawer I once opened under supervision, there was a sealed box labeled only with a year, 1633. Inside was a narrow vial containing what looked like dust and a parchment slip with a single sentence, "From the floor beneath the tribunal." I didn't ask whose tribunal. I didn't need to. That was the year of Galileo's trial, when the Inquisition summoned him to explain why he dared claim the earth was not at the center of the universe. The Church had already condemned heliocentrism by then, calling it heresy. Galileo tried to reason with them. He brought evidence, diagrams, letters. He argued that truth observed in nature did not contradict Scripture, but revealed its depth. The response was swift. He was forced to recant. What remains in the archive is not just his argument, but the weight of the silence that followed. Letters were written about him behind closed doors, memos exchanged between bishops, unsure whether the Church had gone too far or not far enough. These are not accusations, they are hesitations, centuries-old doubt, quietly filed away. Among the pages from that era are notes with sentences crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again. You can see the trembling in the script, as if the hands that wrote them were caught between conviction and fear. The Vatican did not erase Galileo's voice, but it did place it on a shelf so far from reach that only in recent decades has it been fully brought into the light. This is a pattern I began to recognize. The archive does not shout, it murmurs. You must listen to what was not said, what was delayed, what was stored too far back to be an accident. That is where the real stories live. The most haunting thing is this. Even when the Church reversed its stance centuries later, acknowledging that Galileo had been right, the original files were never destroyed. They were not even edited. They remained intact, like a scar that refuses to fade. I once asked a priest why they kept such a painful chapter so close, so carefully protected. He smiled faintly and said, "The Church must remember its failures too. I have carried that line with me ever since." because in this place the story is not just what the church taught, it is what it could not bear to admit until it had no other choice. And even then, some truths were allowed only to whisper. There was a room deeper in the archive where the walls seemed to press in more tightly, as though the air itself carried the weight of hesitation. It was smaller than the others, colder, with shelves that reached from floor to ceiling and bore no signs or numbers. This was not a room for researchers. It was a room for memory without an audience. The documents inside were organized not by topic, but by time, decades of material grouped by eras of quiet crisis. One section, faintly labeled with a smudge of ink, bore the name Clement. Another, simply 1939. That was where I found a folder that contained no official crest and no cover page. Only pages fastened with twine, their edges browned with age. What I held was not doctrine, not law, but correspondence between the Vatican and the German Reich. Not proclamations, letters, personal, cautious, and written in careful diplomatic language that blurred the line between condemnation and cooperation. They were not the statements of a silent church. They were the voice of one trying to walk a path too narrow for virtue alone. Some pages spoke of fear, others of protection, reports from bishops in occupied territories describing disappearances, the rounding up of families, the burning of homes. One letter asked directly, "What is our obligation when we are not permitted to intervene?" Another asked, "How do we protect the faithful if the cost is the church itself?" These were not excuses. They were questions without answers. The Vatican has long been accused of doing too little during those years, of being silent. But inside this folder, what I found was something far more painful than silence. It was awareness, and a deep, agonizing uncertainty about what to do with that awareness. These documents were not hidden because they denied responsibility. They were hidden because they exposed it. At the bottom of the stack was a letter unsigned, its ink darker than the rest, as if written later or rewritten many times. It contained a single sentence that chilled me more than anything else in that file. "If we speak, we may lose the church. If we do not, we may lose the soul of the world." There was no date, no envelope. It was folded in on itself and placed at the back. I have never known who wrote it, or whether it was ever seen by anyone else before that night. But I understood, holding it in my hands, why some truths are kept behind more than just locked doors. Some truths are kept behind the fragile barrier of what a people can bear to remember. Not every secret in the Vatican is about war or science. Some are far older, quieter, and more unsettling. There is a drawer I remember well, one tucked behind a false panel that had to be removed by hand, with a faint notch at the edge that barely showed. I was not meant to find it, but once I did, I couldn't forget what was inside. It was a stack of letters, small, aged, written in the same careful handwriting, though each addressed to a different pope. They were dated from the 1800s to the early 1900s, and all bore the same subject at their center: visions, apparitions, encounters with something divine that had not been approved, not canonized, and not acknowledged. One by one, they told stories of individuals, most of them women, who claimed to have seen figures of light, to have received messages that were clear, detailed, and deeply unsettling for the church at the time. These were not the famous visions that become pilgrimage sites. These were the ones that never left the room. What struck me was not the content of the visions, but the responses. Attached to each letter was a Vatican reply, usually brief, always formal. The responses never accused these people of lying, nor did they outright reject their experiences. Instead, they thanked the sender and assured them that the matter had been noted and would be handled by the appropriate office. Then, nothing more. No further investigation, no declaration, no public word. But here in the archive, the entire exchange had been preserved, not discarded, not dismissed, preserved in silence. I began to understand that the Church does not always deny what it cannot accept. Sometimes it simply shelves it. One vision in particular stayed with me. A woman from southern Italy had written that she had seen a figure surrounded by smoke and fire, who told her that the Church was facing a wound it could not heal with Scripture alone. Her letter was not fanatical. It was composed, sorrowful, deeply devout. The Vatican's response was polite but final. No record of her vision appears anywhere else, not in diocesan notes, not in theological debate. And yet here it was, in her own handwriting, untouched for more than a century. I wondered if she had ever known her letter was even received, or if she died believing heaven had fallen silent. The Church has its processes for discerning truth from delusion, faith from illusion. But when that line is too blurred to draw, the result does not disappear. It waits quietly, somewhere between reverence and fear. There is a peculiar quiet that settles over the deeper levels of the archive, one not born from silence alone, but from something heavier. Down there, the temperature drops, the air grows dry, and the stone begins to feel less like part of a building and more like a buried tomb. This is where the oldest records are kept, not the doctrinal writings or papal decrees that shaped public policy, but personal correspondences between the Vatican and the crowned heads of Europe. The language is formal, elegant, but just beneath the surface there is always tension. These were not love letters between allies. They were negotiations between powers with different definitions of truth. And reading them, you realize that the Vatican has always done more than guide the spirit. It has mediated, maneuvered, even manipulated, not for personal gain, but for survival. These were centuries when the Church had no armies, but still fought wars with words. And the archives are where those words were laid to rest. I remember reading through a file labeled only with a country and a date. France, 1791. Inside were letters from a bishop to the Vatican during the early years of the French Revolution. The bishop begged for guidance. Priests were being arrested, churches ransacked, the monarchy was crumbling, and the faithful were torn between loyalty to the crown and fear of the guillotine. The Vatican's reply was measured, almost cold. It offered no blessing, no condemnation, only the advice to protect the sacraments and avoid political involvement. But tucked at the end of the folder was a second letter. It was unsigned and written in hurried, almost frantic Latin. It said, "We cannot remain neutral if neutrality becomes a kind of betrayal." That letter was never sent. It was folded, ink smeared, and buried in the back of the file. These hidden correspondences are not relics. They are decisions the world was never meant to see. The Vatican's dialogue with emperors, fascists, and revolutionaries did not always align with its public voice. That is not a scandal. It is a reflection of the impossible role the Church has tried to fill. A voice for peace in a world that rarely offers room for purity. And when those contradictions became too sharp, the answers weren't erased. They were filed away, perhaps for future generations to read with more mercy than the present could allow. That is the strange grace of these halls. They preserve not just what was holy, but what was human, and sometimes what was too fragile to speak aloud. There was one shelf I came to visit more than once, though I never touched the files unless instructed. It was narrow and tucked near the corner of a reading chamber, lit by a single hanging bulb. The folders were slimmer than most and bound in linen, not leather, marked with delicate stamps indicating restricted visual material. These were not texts or transcripts. These were paintings, images that had never hung in basilicas or galleries. Works commissioned in secret or recovered quietly and deemed too troubling to display. One folder, I recall, held a series of sketches attributed to a student of Caravaggio, though there was no formal attribution. The images were brutal, raw, and deeply spiritual in a way that did not flatter doctrine. One in particular showed a figure in papal robes kneeling not in prayer but in despair, surrounded by fire on one side and empty pews on the other. It was not a portrait of reverence, it was a portrait of dread, and it had been sealed since the late 17th century. Some of the artworks were unfinished, others had been clearly altered, eyes scratched out, halos darkened, captions removed. You could see the church wrestling not just with ideas, but with aesthetics, trying to find a visual language that could contain the complexity of faith in moments when faith felt shattered. A few pieces appeared to depict scriptural scenes, but with unsettling distortions, Mary weeping not at the foot of the cross, but at a closed cathedral door, Christ turning away from the crowd, a lamb bearing wounds that seemed almost too real. These were not heretical. They were emotional truths too sharp for a church that preferred clarity. I asked once why these pieces were never displayed, even in academic settings. A priest who had worked in the archive for years told me, because they're not theology, they're confession. That line stayed with me. These works weren't meant to teach. They were meant to wrestle with the darkness inside belief itself. And for that reason, they were buried, protected, perhaps, or simply postponed. But the images remained, pressed between tissue paper and velvet, waiting. It is easy to forget that the Church has always been a patron of art. But not all art is meant for celebration. Some is meant to bear witness, and the Vatican, in its silence, chose to keep that witness locked away, not erased, not defaced, just hidden, until the world is ready to see pain without demanding resolution. Not every room in the Vatican archives is filled with grandeur. Some are little more than narrow corridors of paper, dimly lit and braced with cold iron shelves that creak when the air shifts. But there is one space I remember clearly, more for the feeling it gave me than for anything I saw there. It was a room of rejected saints, not in any official sense, not labeled or categorized that way, but that is what they were. Folders full of people whose lives were once petitioned for sainthood, but whose paths never made it past the final gate. There were no accusations of heresy, no formal denials, just lives that stopped just short of elevation. The reasons varied: unproven miracles, uncertain accounts, politics. But reading their stories, I couldn't help but feel that the barrier was never simply theological. It was personal, emotional, sometimes even fearful. One file I found told the story of a Spanish priest who had given his life caring for plague victims in the 16th century. His parish records were glowing. Letters from survivors praised his mercy. There were even witness accounts of a healing that could not be explained, yet his name was never canonized. Buried in the file was a note, unsigned, that read, "He showed too much mercy to those condemned, nothing more." The implication was clear. He had offered kindness to those deemed beyond salvation, and for that his memory was quietly set aside. The Church, in some moments, has drawn boundaries even around grace. Another file contained the biography of a woman mystic from Bavaria who had written hundreds of letters describing visions of the Virgin Mary, many of which matched known apparitions that had been accepted elsewhere. Her writings were articulate, poetic, reverent, but they also contained warnings, subtle critiques of clerical authority, gentle but persistent. Her file was filled with letters of support from local priests, and yet the final decision was marked deferred indefinitely. I later learned that the Vatican rarely revisits such cases. Once deferred, they remain in limbo. These folders are not listed in public databases. They are kept quiet, out of view. Not to shame the dead, but to avoid reopening questions the Church has chosen to let sleep. but the effect is the same. Whole lives of deep faith, sacrifice, and vision, forgotten not by accident, but by choice. And yet, within the archive, they are still preserved. They wait in silence between recognition and erasure, as if the Church, unable to fully accept or reject them, has offered them a third fate, to be remembered in secret. There are maps in the Vatican archives that no longer match the world we know. Rolled tightly in drawers or stitched into aging folios, they chart forgotten boundaries, vanished dioceses, and ecclesiastical territories long erased by war, plague, or politics. Most are fragile, their edges flaking with age, but the detail is astonishing. Mountains drawn with careful hatch marks, rivers named in Latin, and cities marked with small golden crosses to indicate the presence of an ordained bishop or monastery. These are not just records of geography, they are records of faith's reach, of where the Church once had a voice, even if that voice has since gone silent. I remember opening one tube that hadn't been unsealed in decades. Inside was a vellum map of the Languedoc region of France, dated just after the Albigensian Crusade. In the corner, written in faint red ink, was a note. Diocese no longer recognized. No explanation, no footnote, just that quiet acknowledgement of removal. The most unsettling map I ever saw wasn't even complete. It was a floor plan. A monastery drawn from overhead, labeled with Latin room names and thick boundary walls. At first, it looked like any other ecclesiastical building from the Middle Ages, but near the edge of the parchment, someone had drawn a narrow corridor that extended beyond the official boundary. It was unlabeled, no arrow, no key, but someone had taken the time to darken its lines, as if to mark it not just as a path, but as something intentional. The monastery was Montségur, known as the final stronghold of the Cathars, a Christian sect declared heretical and crushed in a brutal siege in 1244. According to official history, nearly all defenders were burned alive, yet here, on this map, was a passage that led away from the main hall, a way out. Its presence has never been publicly acknowledged, and I have never seen it referenced in any historical account. These maps do not scream for attention. They don't rewrite history in dramatic fashion, but they whisper of alternate paths, of routes not taken, voices not heard, and endings that may not have been as final as we thought. The Vatican has kept them carefully, never displayed them, never destroyed them. That, perhaps, is what makes them so powerful. In the age of satellites and search engines, these delicate documents remind us that even today, not all truths are visible from above. Some must be uncovered one layer at a time by those willing to read the margins. One of the most carefully guarded stories in the archive surrounds not a prophecy, nor a heresy, but a scientific plea. In 1613, Galileo Galilei wrote a letter addressed to a high-ranking church official, defending his view that the earth moved around the sun. He argued that this belief, which he called heliocentrism, did not contradict the Bible, but rather deepened its meaning when properly interpreted. The letter was thoughtful, measured, respectful. He even included interpretations of Scripture to show harmony between faith and observation. But his words were met with resistance. By 1616, heliocentrism had been formally declared heretical, and in 1633, Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition. For years it was believed that the letter had been lost, perhaps destroyed or censored, but it was not. I saw it myself one evening in the archives, stored in a flat wooden box beneath layers of protective paper. The ink had faded, but the words remained intact, carefully written, painfully clear. The Church knew exactly what Galileo was arguing, and it chose silence over dialogue. What is less well known is how many internal Vatican notes surrounded that letter. There were memos exchanged between cardinals and advisors, some urging a softer response, others advocating for a swift and public condemnation. One note in particular caught my attention. It read, "To allow this idea is to lose the axis of our authority." It was not theology being defended, it was hierarchy. The fear was not that Galileo was wrong, it was that he might be right, and that rightness would shift the foundation of the Church's ability to define the structure of the universe. That is the kind of fear that does not fade easily. Galileo's recantation was forced. He lived the rest of his life under house arrest. But the archive tells a longer, more painful story, one where ideas were not just debated, but hidden, boxed, and shelved. The Vatican eventually cleared Galileo's name centuries later. His views are now accepted as fact, and his legacy as a pioneer of science is secure. But still, the letter remains in its box, in its drawer, wrapped with care and stored behind quiet doors. It is not just a scientific document. It is a reminder that the Church, like any human institution, has wrestled with the limits of its own certainty. And perhaps, buried even deeper than the letter itself, is the unspoken question: how many other voices were folded quietly away, simply because the timing was wrong? Among the most enigmatic and quietly controversial folders I encountered was one that bore no crest, no seal, and no clear origin. It had been stored in the far left corner of a drawer marked Templum in faded ink. The folder was thin but stiff, and inside were copies of documents long thought destroyed, records related to the trial of the Knights Templar. For centuries, it was believed that the Vatican had either sanctioned or condoned the total erasure of the Templars, a once powerful military order accused of heresy, blasphemy, and unspeakable acts. In 1307, their leaders were arrested by King Philip IV of France and tortured into confession. The Church's role in the affair has always been shadowed in ambiguity, but here, in the archives, I saw the truth, quiet, measured, and hidden in plain script. The most astonishing item in the file was a copy of a document known as the Chinon parchment, discovered only recently by scholars, but held in this vault for centuries. It bore the name of Pope Clement V and described a secret absolution granted to the Templar leadership. In essence, the Pope had forgiven them, recognized their faith, and sought to preserve their dignity. But that act of mercy was never made public. The persecution continued. The executions went forward. The Church stood by as the Templars were burned, their property seized, their legacy buried under rumor and political convenience. The absolution, though authentic, was archived. Quietly, almost guiltily. The parchment was folded 3 times, each crease worn thin by time. Next to it, in another folder, was a transcript of a private conversation between papal envoys debating whether to announce the absolution. One line stood out to me. To reveal this now is to invite ruin. The decision was made. Silence, once again, proved the safer choice. It was not that the truth was denied. It was simply postponed indefinitely. The Knights Templar remain a subject of fascination for many. Their myths have outgrown their reality, but within the walls of the archive, stripped of drama, their story becomes something much more human. A brotherhood destroyed not by faith or heresy, but by fear and power. The Church did not forget them. It remembered everything, but it chose not to speak. I think that is what haunts me most about the Vatican archives. It is not the presence of darkness. It is the presence of light, carefully boxed, perfectly preserved, and locked behind the kind of silence that feels more like grief than secrecy. There is a moment in history that lingers like smoke in a closed room, and the Vatican archives hold it delicately, as though even memory must tread softly. The execution of Giordano Bruno in 1600 is remembered by some as a necessary punishment and by others as an unforgivable wound. Bruno was not just a philosopher. He was a former Dominican friar, a thinker who spoke of infinite worlds, of a universe too vast to place man at its center. He believed that divinity was not confined to sacred texts, but echoed through the stars. And for that, he was summoned to Rome, interrogated, imprisoned for years, and finally sentenced to death for heresy. That much is known. What is rarely seen is what lies in the drawers labeled Inquisitio, the Vatican's records of the trial itself. And it was in that section, one night, that I found the most devastating piece of all, a note written not by Bruno, but by one of his judges. The note was brief, only a few lines, but it carried more weight than any decree. If we spare him, doctrine will fracture. If we destroy him, memory will not forgive. The handwriting was tight, deliberate. It had been written with the knowledge that there were no good options. The Church, at the time, was already straining against pressures from all sides. Reformers in the North, skepticism in the universities, political tensions on every border. Bruno's defiance was not merely theological. It was symbolic. He stood at the intersection of knowledge and faith, unwilling to yield, and for that he was silenced. But the silence did not erase him. The archive holds more than the judgment. It holds the correspondence leading up to it. Letters from cardinals debating whether Bruno's views were dangerous or simply premature. One bishop wrote, "He is not faithless, he is fearless, and perhaps that is more troubling." These were not the words of fanatics. They were the words of men afraid of losing control of a world that was changing too quickly for them to explain. And even now, 4 centuries later, the Vatican does not forget. The records have never been destroyed. They are not celebrated. But they remain, carefully indexed, quietly acknowledged. When I walked out of that room, I remember glancing back once more at the drawer that held his name. It was closed, unmarked, no plaque, no title. And yet I felt as if I had just spoken with someone who had been waiting a very long time to be remembered not as a heretic, but as a warning that the truth, once feared, never truly disappears. It waits. Tucked deep in a section labeled Conciliatio, meaning reconciliation or concord, I found a series of letters that could have rewritten the most profound division in Christian history. These were not formal decrees or theological proclamations. They were exchanges, quiet, tentative, handwritten dialogues between early Protestant reformers and Vatican officials during the fragile first decades of the Reformation. Most people know the story of Martin Luther nailing his theses to the church door and triggering a cascade of religious upheaval. But few know how close both sides came, for a brief moment, to choosing dialogue over division. Within these pages, Luther was not a distant enemy. He was a voice on the other end of a conversation the church desperately wanted to control, but for a moment also considered understanding. One letter, dated 1531, bore the mark of Bishop Girolamo Aleandro, a Vatican envoy sent north to meet with reformist thinkers in the German principalities. In this particular note, Aleandro suggested that the Church might concede certain minor doctrinal points to avoid full separation, points about clerical celibacy, vernacular liturgy, and indulgences. His tone was cautious, but sincere. He urged the papacy to consider that healing the wound might be more vital than preserving every tradition. Attached was a draft reply to Luther, respectful in tone and phrased in a way that acknowledged the reformer's theological concerns without condemnation. It ended with the line, "Unity is not the absence of error, but the will to remain one body despite it." That letter was never sent. Next to the draft was a rejection written in a different hand, sharper, more defensive. It warned that any attempt to compromise would appear as weakness, and that hesitation would embolden the movement to break away entirely. The advice was heeded. Communications ceased. The divide became permanent. The letters were filed away, their possibility buried beneath the weight of history's new path. What struck me most was not the content of the debate, but the humanity behind it. The fear of loss, the desire to avoid it, and the heavy burden of pride that made reconciliation impossible. The Vatican did not destroy these letters. It kept them hidden, not because they were false, but because they were true in a way that the world never got to see. They revealed a moment when humility could have changed the course of faith for millions. And perhaps that is the tragedy of the archive. It holds not only what was done, but what could have been, what almost was. The day I found the architectural records was ordinary in every way. I had been assigned to help relocate a set of inventory binders from one chamber to another. They were heavy, dust-covered, and meticulously labeled, each marked with the name of an abbey, cathedral, or fortress that once served as part of the church's physical domain. Most were blueprints, floor plans, and restoration diagrams, expected material for an archive of this scope. But one roll, thicker than the rest and sealed with aged wax, caught my attention. Its label had faded, but the name Montségur had been scrawled faintly along the edge. I knew the name from history. It was the last stronghold of the Cathars, a religious group condemned as heretical and besieged in 1244 by a crusade sanctioned by the Church. Hundreds perished there. Most were burned alive. The place had become a symbol of the Church's darker chapters. I unrolled the parchment carefully and found a floor plan of the abbey drawn with expert precision. The usual layout, hall, chapel, dormitories, was all there. But then I saw something that did not match any official record. There was a passage, narrow and angled, leading away from the main structure into the mountain itself. It was drawn in darker ink, as though added after the original plan had been completed. There was no label, no exit marked, no explanation, but the path clearly bypassed the main gate where the defenders had famously surrendered. I stared at it for a long time, wondering whether this marked an actual escape route or simply the desperate hope of one. The records say the Cathars died to the last soul. But if this passage existed and was used, then someone may have survived. Someone may have carried a story the Church never wanted repeated. What was most revealing was how the document was filed. It had been tucked between two unrelated diagrams, an abbey in northern Spain and a fortress in southern Italy. Not misfiled, but hidden in plain sight. Someone had wanted it preserved, but not found. That's what the Vatican archive does better than anything else. It holds the possibility of truth without committing to it. It allows memory to rest without ever letting it vanish. And in doing so, it keeps history fluid, not rewritten, but forever unresolved. I returned the scroll to its place, resealed it, and said nothing. Some discoveries are not meant to be claimed. They are meant to sit quietly, like that passage in the mountain, waiting for someone brave or burdened enough to follow it through. Among the most emotionally difficult records I came across was a series of detailed inventories dated during the early 1800s, each itemized under a single heading, spoliazioni, spoils. These were the years of Napoleon's occupation of Italy, when French forces swept through the peninsula not only with armies but with orders. They looted libraries, emptied churches, and confiscated archives. The Vatican, once a sovereign spiritual kingdom with its own diplomatic muscle, was treated like a weakened vault, something to be cracked open and emptied. The Pope, at the time, Pius VII, was taken prisoner. The Vatican archives were packed into crates, labeled in French, and hauled by mule train and wagon over the Alps to Paris. Tens of thousands of manuscripts, scrolls, and relics were removed. Not all of them returned. What remains in the archive today is a record of that trauma, cold, factual, and devastating. Each box sent to France was catalogued by Vatican scribes before departure, with heartbreaking precision. You can see the strain in their penmanship. One list includes descriptions like silver-threaded chalice, gift of the Queen of Poland, 1683, and Codex Aureus, illuminated gospel, origin uncertain, possibly Saxon. Another simply reads, Volumes 1 to 18, Private Correspondences, Papal Succession, Do Not Separate. The notes grow more terse as the lists continue, as though the very act of writing them down was an admission of helplessness. In one folder I found a letter written by a clerk to his superior, dated just days before the shipment began. It was written in Latin, but the despair came through clearly. "We are being stripped of our memory," he wrote. "What is the Church without her witness?" The answer, I suspect, lay in the urgency with which they tried to preserve what little they could. The archives contained duplicate pages, hand-copied under pressure, some only half-transcribed before the originals were seized. There are annotations written in the margins by candlelight, marked "From Memory" or "Last Known Version." It was an act of defiance, but also of grief. Many of the documents were eventually returned after Napoleon's fall, though not all. Some were lost in transit, others disappeared into French institutions, and a few never left private hands. What the Vatican reclaimed was carefully reintegrated, often without fanfare. Yet in a drawer marked only "Post Reditus," after the return, I found a final entry. We recovered the pages, but not the soul. It was unsigned, just a closing note. But it said more than any ledger ever could. The archive had survived, but it would never be whole again. Not all of the Vatican's entanglements with power came from Europe. One quiet afternoon, while reviewing correspondence files from the 17th century, I came across a section of letters marked with strange titles, none in Latin, but in Portuguese and Japanese. The documents had been stored in a long drawer labeled Orientalia Ecclesiae, and they bore crests not from Rome, but from Jesuit missions in East Asia. Inside were copies of diplomatic exchanges between the Vatican and the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan, written at a time when Christianity was forbidden by law and punished with death. What stunned me wasn't the fact that such communication existed, but the manner in which it was carried out. These weren't official papal bulls or missionary logs. They were hidden letters, smuggled inside wooden figurines and delivered by merchants under the cover of trade. One letter, dated 1611, was especially remarkable. It appeared to come from the court of Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. It was short, written in Portuguese by a scribe on behalf of the shogun, and addressed to the Bishop of the Men of the Cross. In it, the writer acknowledged the intellectual curiosity and moral discipline of Christian missionaries, but clearly rejected the religion's impact on the social order. "A faith that divides fathers from sons," it read, "cannot be allowed to take root." The tone was neither hostile nor dismissive. It was measured, as if the shogunate understood the power of belief, but feared the fracture it might bring. I found it haunting that such a letter, diplomatic in tone and full of restrained understanding, had never been discussed outside these walls. The reply from the Vatican was never sent, at least not according to the records. A draft sat alongside the Japanese letter, filled with careful praise and attempts at theological bridge building. It even referenced shared virtues, discipline, reverence, community. But at the bottom of the page, someone had written in dark red ink, "No response, too dangerous." It was a line that echoed the precarious nature of global faith in an age of empires. These letters were never part of the official histories taught in seminaries or written into missionary accounts. Yet they tell a different kind of story, one not of conquest or conversion, but of brief, vulnerable attempts at understanding across vast cultural divides. The Vatican kept these documents, knowing that they represented more than failed diplomacy. They represented the difficulty of planting spiritual roots in soil shaped by other ancient orders. And rather than erasing the attempt, the Church stored it gently, like a conversation too delicate to finish. There is a room in the archive where almost nothing is labeled in Latin. The folders are older, flimsier, often hand-stitched, and many of the documents inside are written not in church script, but in local dialects, translated awkwardly into Italian or French. This is the section devoted to colonial missions, a place that reveals not doctrine, but diplomacy wrapped in vestments and sent across oceans. The further I dug into those drawers, the more I realized that faith was not always the first priority. Mixed into letters from missionaries were memos, reports, and appeals addressed to kings, viceroys, and naval commanders. Evangelization and empire had long walked side by side, but these documents made it painfully clear just how closely their steps had matched. One folder held a long chain of correspondence between the Vatican and Portuguese administrators in Brazil during the 17th century. The official letters described efforts to baptize native populations, build churches, and translate scripture. But beneath the surface, the content darkened. Attached was a letter from a Jesuit priest reporting the mutilation of enslaved villagers who failed to meet labor quotas. He described the scene in unflinching detail: men with missing limbs, women begging not for food but for forgiveness they believed they no longer deserved. The priest pleaded for the Vatican to intervene. His language was restrained but desperate. He called the situation a mockery of Christ's name, inflicted in Christ's name. The reply from Rome was brief. It offered prayers and recommended further dialogue with the local authorities. No directive followed. In another file, I found reports from missionaries in the Congo, one of them recounting that newly converted children were being used as proof of civility in front of colonial inspectors, paraded and baptized, not out of belief, but as political theater. It was all documented in careful handwriting, as if writing it down might make it less horrifying. The most chilling letter in the folder came from a bishop who had returned to Europe and wrote directly to a cardinal saying, "If this is the price of souls, then I fear we are selling our own." These records were not hidden to protect theology. They were hidden because they complicated the story the Church needed to tell. They made it harder to believe that faith had always led, rather than followed, the flag. And yet, the Vatican kept them, not erased, not burned, simply sealed. As if the Church itself could not decide whether remembering these things was a betrayal of its mission, or the only way to remain honest about what that mission had cost. It was deep in the older vaults, in a compartment marked only by a numeric code, that I came across a bundle wrapped in cloth rather than stored in a folder. The outer layer was soft linen, stained by age and time, and tied with a cord that had clearly been handled many times. Inside were transcripts, pages of inked debate from a gathering that reshaped the Catholic Church forever, the Second Vatican Council. Most of the world knows it as the moment when Latin was replaced by local languages, when the Church opened its doors to dialogue with Jews, Muslims, and even non-believers. But within this cloth was the shadow version of that history, the pieces that never made it into the public declarations. What I held were handwritten transcripts of private debates between high-ranking cardinals, moments where doctrine was almost bent further, only to be pulled back at the last moment. One debate in particular centered on the use of Latin in Mass. One cardinal argued fiercely that Latin preserved a sacred continuity. He claimed it created a bridge across centuries, a way for believers to speak in the tongue of saints. But another cardinal, equally passionate, said plainly, "If we keep speaking in a language no one understands, we are no longer offering a liturgy." We are offering a performance. The room, according to the transcript, fell silent after that. The matter was resolved by compromise. Local languages would be allowed, but Latin would never be abandoned. The Vatican's public face was unity, but here in the archive I saw the cracks that had opened beneath it. Tucked alongside the transcripts was something even more surprising, a draft of a speech by Pope Paul VI that was never delivered. In it, he addressed the Holocaust not just as a tragedy, but as a spiritual failure of silence. He wrote that the Church must ask forgiveness not for crimes committed, but for words withheld. The speech was never given. Instead, a more neutral version was read, one that stressed the horrors of war without naming the Church's own hesitation. In the margins of the draft, in a different hand, was a small Latin phrase: Tempus non dominet. The time has not yet come. I sat with that bundle in my lap for a long time. It weighed more than parchment should. It weighed with the force of honesty left half-spoken. The Church had begun to change during Vatican II, but beneath the transformation, it had buried the struggle, folded in cloth, and stored away. Not to deny it, but perhaps to protect what could not yet be confessed. There is a narrow chamber near the end of one corridor that rarely sees light. It contains no gilded manuscripts, no relics behind glass. Instead, it houses boxes, plain, undecorated, and stacked with methodical precision. These are the missionary dossiers, collections of field reports sent back to the Vatican from every corner of the world during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Each box is labeled only by region and year: India, 1874, Vietnam, 1901, West Africa, 1885. At first glance, they seem like simple administrative documents, but the deeper you read, the more a pattern begins to emerge. These were not just accounts of baptismal numbers and building projects. They were subtle portraits of empire, scenes of cultural erosion, fear, and the tension between spiritual duty and colonial politics. One box, marked Cochinchina, 1883, contained a report from a French missionary describing his uneasy alliance with colonial officers. He wrote about efforts to convert local villagers, but in the same paragraph, he noted how French troops had used the mission school as a base of operations during an uprising. "We bring the cross," he wrote, "but it is shadowed by the rifle." In another letter, a Vietnamese convert confessed in a journal that he could no longer tell if the prayers he had learned were acts of faith or submission. His priest had instructed him to burn his ancestral shrine and renounce local customs. "I obeyed," the man wrote, "but I did not feel saved. I felt emptied." These letters were not meant for public eyes. They were sent to the Vatican for review, stamped and filed by secretaries who likely read them with tightening throats. One particularly chilling letter came from the Belgian Congo. A bishop there had witnessed atrocities committed by Leopold's private army and reported them directly to Rome. He described mutilations, forced labor, and churches built with the blood of unwilling hands. His plea for intervention was strong but respectful. The response? A single-page letter: "We will pray for strength. Intervention is not within our authority." That moment stuck with me, not because of malice, but because of absence. The Vatican did not deny these reports. It simply did not act on them. And that, in many ways, is more haunting. These missionary records show that the Church often stood at the edge of a chasm, watching, documenting, and preserving what it could not or would not change. In that silence lies a truth not about belief, but about power. And in these boxes the silence has weight, inked carefully and stored with all the reverence of a sacrament. I remember the first time I saw the seal. It was red, cracked, and faded at the edges, pressed into the wax of a slim folder kept at the bottom of a drawer labeled Archivia Temporalis. There was no title on the folder, no crest, only a hand-scrawled note that read, Montségur. I had seen the name before, in older maps, in siege records, in whispered references throughout the archive. But this folder was different. It didn't contain papal correspondence or theological judgments. It contained a map, a single hand-drawn floor plan of the ancient abbey, dating from the early 13th century. The lines were precise, every corridor labeled in Latin, every chamber marked with care. But what caught my eye was a single corridor that branched off from the main cloister, curling into the side of the mountain. It was faintly inked, less certain than the rest, and bore no label. But someone had drawn it intentionally. Someone had seen or imagined a way out. Montségur is known as the last refuge of the Cathars, a religious sect deemed heretical by the church and crushed in a brutal campaign. The siege of Montségur in 1244 ended in fire. Hundreds were killed. The official story holds that none survived, and yet here was a map preserved within the walls of the Vatican that suggested something else, a passage, an escape, or perhaps a myth committed to paper, just plausible enough to keep. I traced the line with my finger, imagining the moment when someone, perhaps a frightened monk, perhaps a fleeing believer, slipped into the mountain and vanished. There was no accompanying text, no commentary from the church. The map had been folded and refolded until the creases formed a perfect grid, the ink beginning to wear thin at the joints. But it had not been discarded. Someone had chosen to keep it tucked away and unremarked. Why? Was it evidence? Was it regret? Or was it simply a refusal to let even a whisper of defiance disappear? The archives are filled with truths we've come to accept, decisions, edicts, dogmas, but occasionally they hold a different kind of truth, the suggestion that something remains unresolved. This map did not rewrite the history of Montségur. It didn't bring back the dead or undo the flames, but it made me wonder who escaped, if anyone did, and more importantly, whether the Church, by keeping this map, was acknowledging that even its most final judgments may still leave room for mystery, for doubt, for something or someone to slip quietly through the cracks. One evening, as the lamps burned low and the shadows of the shelves grew long, I was asked to assist in retrieving documents from a locked cabinet reserved for high-level diplomatic records. The folder I was handed bore a curious inscription, Concordats Reserved. The word conjured the idea of harmony, of sacred agreements between the Vatican and sovereign states. But as I began to read, it became clear that these were not peaceful accords. They were uneasy bargains, negotiations crafted not in moments of spiritual triumph, but in times of political danger. Each document was a thread in a web the Church had woven to survive in hostile climates, whether under monarchs or modern regimes. These concordats were not declarations of shared values. They were shields, and sometimes masks. One file in particular drew my attention. An unsigned draft of an agreement between the Holy See and a European fascist state during the 1930s. The language was precise, cautious. It guaranteed the Church protection in exchange for its silence on certain policies. The agreement never named those policies outright, but a separate note, handwritten, clearly not meant for official filing, listed what was understood: censorship, the dissolution of religious schools deemed subversive, the surveillance of minority clergy. The Vatican, in that moment, was walking a tightrope between influence and complicity, and the language of the Concordat was its balancing pole. There were other concordats, too, some signed, others left to linger as negotiations fell apart. One file held pages from talks with a South American dictatorship in the 1970s. The government sought to limit Church criticism of its human rights abuses in return for continued tax exemptions and access to broadcast channels. The Vatican's response was not a firm yes, but not a refusal either. The pages were filled with phrases like under review, for further discernment and pending internal clarification. The church didn't say it would stand down, but it didn't say it wouldn't. Reading these documents, I began to understand that survival for an institution as old as the Vatican requires decisions that are rarely black or white. To remain present in places of oppression, the Church has often chosen discretion over defiance. Whether that was wise or cowardly is a judgment for history to make. The archive makes no argument, it only preserves. But as I held those pages, delicate, yellowing, sometimes smudged, I felt the weight of choices made in fear, in pragmatism, in hope. Concordats are not just treaties. They are reflections of what the Church has been willing to risk in order to endure, and what it was not ready to sacrifice. The Vatican we know today, a sovereign city-state enclosed by walls, guarded by Swiss uniforms and diplomatic protocol, only came into existence in 1929. But for nearly 60 years before that, the Vatican existed in an unusual and almost spectral state. From 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy seized the Papal States, until the signing of the Lateran Treaty, the popes lived as prisoners within their own walls. They refused to recognize the Italian government and would not step outside the Vatican grounds. To most, this is a forgotten footnote of political history, but in the archives, this era is captured in remarkable and fragile clarity. A time when the Church was landless, publicly silent, and yet behind closed doors, more globally active than ever before. One drawer contained diplomatic correspondence that spanned this so-called prisoner in the Vatican era. Letters were sent not to Italy, but to governments across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. These weren't public messages. They were confidential notes, coded dispatches, quiet appeals. The Church, unable to operate as a state, became something else, an invisible axis of spiritual diplomacy. One letter dated 1881, written by a Vatican official to the Austrian Empire, expressed concerns over the secularization of education in Eastern Europe. It offered assistance in shaping new school curricula if the Church could maintain influence through chaplaincies. Another letter, to the Spanish crown, outlined a strategy for strengthening Catholic identity in colonies where indigenous resistance was growing. But the most astonishing document in that drawer was a memorandum addressed to the United States in 1922. It was unsigned, possibly never delivered, but clearly authentic. In it, the Vatican offered to serve as an intermediary in post-war negotiations among Catholic-majority nations fractured by the First World War. The language was formal, but unmistakably strategic. The Vatican had no borders, no embassies, and no army. Yet here it was, positioning itself as a potential peacemaker between sovereign states. The document closed with the phrase, "Where borders divide, faith may still bind." That sentence struck me with an eerie resonance. In a time when the Church had no land, it leaned entirely on its memory, its reach, and its capacity to move without being seen. What becomes clear in reading these files is that the Vatican never vanished during those lost decades. It adapted. It turned inward, built a network of silent messengers and trusted liaisons, and prepared for the moment it would re-emerge with full diplomatic recognition. The Lateran Treaty gave it land once more. But these papers prove that even without territory, the Church never stopped acting as a sovereign force. It simply moved in the space between visibility and influence, and wrote its intentions in ink meant only for chosen eyes. Of all the folders I encountered during my years among the archive's endless shelves, there was one that looked almost too ordinary to notice. It was marked in English, a rarity, and labeled simply U.S. Correspondence 1922. There was no emblem, no stamp of urgency, and nothing to suggest its importance at first glance. But as I opened the folder, the contents told a far more intriguing story. Inside was a draft letter, clearly prepared for delivery to the President of the United States at the time. Warren G. Harding. What made it remarkable was not the letter itself, but the fact that it had never been mentioned in any Vatican record or public history. It was a confidential offer, an appeal for the Holy See to serve as a mediator between the fractured Catholic nations of post-World War I Europe and the growing influence of the United States on the world stage. The language of the letter was careful, formal, and unmistakably diplomatic. It expressed admiration for the United States' growing role in world affairs, while suggesting that faith, specifically shared Catholic heritage, could be used to rebuild bridges in war-torn parts of Europe. In matters where politics fail, the letter read, shared faith may offer ground for unity. It offered no demands, no clear political stance, and certainly no request for recognition. Instead, it extended an invitation for collaboration based on spiritual commonality. It was a soft power maneuver, subtle, veiled, but undeniable in its intent. The Church, landless and diplomatically isolated at the time, was trying to plant roots through relationship rather than territory. What made the document all the more curious was the annotation on the back. Written in Latin, barely legible through the faded ink, were the words sub conditione futura, under future conditions. It was clear that this outreach was provisional, held in reserve until the Vatican could reassert itself on the global stage. That moment would come with the Lateran Treaty in 1929. But this letter revealed that the plans had been in motion well before that, and that the Church had already begun sowing connections in the hope of regaining its influence. There is no record of the letter ever being sent, no reply, no trace of it in U.S. archives, as far as I know, but the Vatican preserved it carefully, as if awaiting the day when such a conversation might become possible. And perhaps that is the most powerful thing the archive reveals. Not just what was said, but what was nearly said. Not just the history that happened, but the future that almost did. A single page, never mailed, still holds the breath of a church watching the world shift and preparing its next move in silence. The Cold War may feel like recent history to some, but deep in the Vatican archives, it takes on the weight of something far more ancient. Another chapter in a long tradition of navigating political fire while guarding spiritual flame. There is a room, less visited than others, where the air feels different, not older, but sharper, as if the paper itself still remembers the tension. The drawers are labeled by region: Polonia, Germania Orientalis, America Latina, and one drawer simply marked Rusicum. These are the files of the Vatican's diplomatic and spiritual involvement during the era of Iron Curtains and nuclear threats. And what they contain is not just church policy, it is a record of how belief moved beneath the surface of global confrontation. In the drawer marked Polonia, I found reports from the early 1970s, years before Pope John Paul II would become the symbol of Polish resistance. They were filled with updates from underground churches, encrypted letters from priests who had gone into hiding, and records of secret masses held in barns, forests, and candlelit basements. But alongside those heroic testaments were quiet strategies. One letter, sent from a bishop to Rome, proposed subtle ways to support labor unions under the guise of providing religious guidance. Another asked whether Vatican funds could be funneled through charitable organizations to keep a printing press running, a press that produced not catechisms, but anti-Soviet pamphlets. The Vatican, according to these files, was not just a bystander. It was playing a cautious game of influence, one rooted in prayer and sacrament, yes, but also in coded messages, untraceable transfers, and strategic silence. The Holy See rarely made public statements about communism's oppression of religion. Instead, it acted quietly, trying to preserve the presence of faith without provoking retaliation. This was diplomacy in whispers. Resistance without banners. In the folder labeled Russicum, I found a list of students trained at the Pontifical Russian College, men prepared to enter the Soviet Union under false identities to minister in secret. Some names were crossed out. Others were followed by a single word: silence. Silent. No record of what became of them, no letters, no reports, just their names, filed in a drawer, remembered in silence. It is easy to imagine the Vatican as a static institution, ancient, ceremonial, untouched by politics, but these files prove otherwise. During the Cold War, the Church was not just surviving, it was navigating shadows, building bridges beneath barbed wire and preserving hope in places where even breath was monitored. And it did so not by shouting, but by writing the truth in margins, then folding those margins into drawers that waited for a safer time to be opened. Of all the records I read, official decrees, urgent pleas, whispered warnings, one document continues to echo more deeply than the rest. It was small, barely more than a page, tucked between routine communications from the 1940s. The paper was thin, the ink slightly blurred, as though written in haste. At the top was no title, no recipient, only a date, 1942. The letter came from a bishop in Krakow. His name, though familiar, didn't strike me at first, but the further I read, the clearer the weight of his words became. He was describing what we now know with devastating certainty: the systematic murder of Jews in German-occupied Poland. His language was clear but restrained, almost reverent in its horror. He spoke of trainloads of the disappeared, of churches looted, of families torn from the altar rail. And at the bottom of the page, one line stood alone: "If we do not speak, we will bear the guilt of complicity before God." The author was Adam Stefan Sapieha, future cardinal and spiritual mentor to Pope John Paul II. His letter was not an accusation. It was a cry for clarity, for action, for some response that would lift the unbearable silence surrounding the Church's position. There were others like it, letters from bishops across Europe, some pleading, some condemning, some merely reporting. All of them paint a portrait not of ignorance, but of awareness without resolution. The Vatican knew. It received these letters. They were read, filed, and preserved. But what was missing was louder than any ink. There was no coordinated outcry, no thunderous denunciation, only brief acknowledgments, occasional notes of sorrow, and quiet prayers sent back in reply. One such reply was filed beside Sapieha's letter. It was not cruel, not dismissive. It simply spoke of the need to maintain unity, to avoid further fracturing the fragile stability of the Church in war-torn lands. It said, the faith must not become a casualty of war. And perhaps that is how the silence began, not in malice, but in fear of losing even more. But silence, when recorded and filed away, becomes its own testimony, and here in the archive, the silence has a voice. These pages remain untouched by revision. No apology is written in the margins. No official interpretation has softened their impact. They remain as they were, a paper trail of knowledge, hesitation, and the terrible burden of not knowing when to speak. And when I folded them back into their folder, I realized that some truths are hidden not because they are secrets, but because they are too heavy for any one moment to carry. So they wait. And when they are read, they do not ask for judgment, only for witness. The documents of war are often stark, factual, and brutal in their language. But in a folder from the early 1940s, tucked among intelligence reports and diplomatic telegrams, I found something unexpectedly human, a handwritten letter, never sent, unsigned, yet clearly drafted by someone close to the papal council. It was written on simple stationery in Italian, with no letterhead or seal. but the message was unmistakably clear. It questioned the Vatican's silence during the Holocaust, not from an external critic, but from within. The writer asked whether caution had become complicity, whether discretion, once a shield, had turned into something darker. The letter did not call for rebellion. It did not blame the Pope. It simply asked, if truth cannot be spoken now, when will it ever be safe to speak? That one page sat between folders labeled Discretione and Riservato. It wasn't logged in the official catalog. It wasn't part of any public declaration. It was a quiet fragment of a conversation that never made it into the open. But its presence spoke volumes. It confirmed what so many had suspected for decades, that within the Vatican itself there were voices urging the Church to act more boldly, and that those voices were, at least for a time, unheard. The Vatican has long defended its choices during World War II by pointing to quiet diplomacy, secret interventions, and efforts made behind closed doors to save lives. And in many cases, those interventions were real. The archive includes records of safe passages, forged baptismal certificates, and underground channels used to hide Jewish families. These were acts of courage, coordinated, discreet, often successful. But they happened in the shadows, and for many survivors and historians, the question has never been whether the Church did something, it's whether it did enough, and why so much of what it did was done in silence. What struck me most about this letter was its ending. After a series of carefully phrased reflections, the writer left a final line, written in slightly darker ink. Faith does not ask us to be safe, it asks us to be true. That sentence haunted me, not because it condemned, but because it understood. It revealed the tension that lives at the heart of every Vatican decision, how to protect the faithful without betraying the faith. In war, that line blurs. In archives, it crystallizes. And in moments like this one, when a truth too dangerous to declare was simply folded, filed, and forgotten, it becomes clear that the deepest questions the Vatican must answer are not written in doctrine. They're written in the voices it chose not to raise. In a long, dust-covered drawer marked simply Concilium, I found the records of a gathering that changed the course of modern Catholicism. The Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, ran from 1962 to 1965 and is remembered as the most transformative church assembly of the 20th century. It was here that Latin was loosened from the liturgy, that the Church acknowledged the dignity of other faiths, and that centuries-old rituals were reconsidered in the light of a rapidly modernizing world. But buried in the back of that drawer, among speeches, voting tallies, and theological drafts, was a document that had never seen the light of day, a proposed resolution that never made it past the floor. It was labeled Schema 13A, unapproved, and it bore the signature of a cardinal whose name was later quietly removed from official council proceedings. The document was short, but its implications were bold. It proposed that the Church formally recognize the damage caused by its institutional silence during major human tragedies, including slavery, colonialism, and the Holocaust. It was a document of self-examination, and in its language was an attempt to reconcile not only with the outside world, but with its own memory. The proposal called for a liturgical day of remembrance, not to assign blame, but to publicly grieve. A church that forgets its wounds, it read, is a church that cannot heal others. The schema was debated according to a transcript I found beside it, but ultimately rejected for being too divisive. One cardinal argued that the document would open old wounds. Another feared that it would be seen as weakness or as an invitation for secular criticism. A third simply said, "The faithful do not come to Mass to apologize." The proposal was shelved, and the official record of the council moved forward without it. But what stayed with me wasn't the rejection, it was the effort. Someone had tried to name the silence, Someone had written in the language of the Church that remembrance is not the opposite of faith, it is one of its most sacred duties. The folder was never destroyed. It was placed in the archive, untouched for decades, and its existence reveals something vital, that even within the highest halls of ecclesiastical power, there are those who believe truth and tradition can walk side by side. Perhaps one day they still will. Until then, the archive holds their voices, waiting for a time when the Church is ready not just to teach history, but to reckon with its own. Among the most quietly disputed topics inside the archive is the language of the Church itself. Not the language of faith, but the literal one, the question of Latin. For centuries it was the heartbeat of Catholic liturgy, uniting believers across borders, centuries, and dialects. It echoed in basilicas from Rome to Manila, recited by the faithful who may not have understood every word, but trusted that sacredness required mystery. During the Second Vatican Council, the question of whether to continue using Latin became more than a matter of translation. It became a confrontation between two visions of the Church, one rooted in timeless continuity, the other in living accessibility. In a folder marked Lingua Sacra Deliberationes, I found transcripts of the closed-door debates that raged over this issue. Some cardinals argued that Latin was the Church's last link to its ancient origins. Others countered that a language no longer spoken by the people was no longer serving them. One bishop, a convert from Africa, spoke of celebrating Mass in a village where no one, not even the priest, understood the words being said. It was not silence, he said. It was absence. His voice, recorded in ink on aged parchment, trembled even through the page. There was a moment of compromise. Local languages would be permitted, but Latin would remain the language of official rites. What did not make it into the public documents was the emotional charge beneath that decision. Notes in the margins showed tension. One cardinal scribbled a sharp warning in Italian. We lose the language, we lose eternity. Another replied below it, no, we lose them. What I remember most clearly was a draft of a homily that was never delivered. It had been written by a priest tasked with explaining the decision to the faithful, but someone chose to suppress it. It ended with a question. What matters more, words that never change, or people who are finally able to hear them? That line was underlined twice in red. No name was attached. Today, Latin is still used in certain rites, still revered by many, but the language of the Church has changed. What hasn't changed is the struggle that unfolded in the archive's quiet corners, a struggle between preservation and connection, between formality and presence. It's easy to believe that these debates were cold intellectual matters. They weren't. They were personal, painful, and in the Vatican archive, they are preserved with the same care given to miracles. Because in their own way, they were. Sometimes the most powerful documents are not the ones made public, but the ones carefully prepared and never delivered. One such file, folded neatly between two council transcripts, was labeled only Paulus VI, Draftus non lectus. It was a speech written by Pope Paul VI during the final sessions of the Second Vatican Council. The handwriting was his, the language was exacting and tender, and the subject was one of the most sensitive topics the Church had yet to face, its own silence during the Holocaust. The speech began with an acknowledgement of grief, not just for the lives lost, but for the weight of inaction. We remember not only those who suffered, it read, but also those whose voices were not raised in time. It did not name names. It did not issue sweeping condemnations, but in its tone was a deep and unmistakable sorrow. Paul VI had intended to speak not just as Pope, but as a witness to a church that had for too long chosen discretion over witness. Our sorrow, he wrote, is not only for what was done, but for what was not. What happened next can only be inferred. Attached to the draft was an internal memo, unsigned, that recommended replacing the speech with a more generalized expression of wartime mourning. The reasoning was pragmatic. "Let not the past divide the present," it read. A revised version of the address was issued shortly after, more diplomatic, less specific, devoid of the original's moral tension. The original speech was filed away, never read aloud, never distributed, never erased. What lingered for me was one phrase, written in the margin in Paul's own hand: "Tempus non dominet." The time has not yet come. It was not a refusal to speak. It was a postponement, and whether it was meant as a promise or an escape, I could not say, but that phrase, left alone on the side of the page, captured something essential about the Vatican's way of holding memory. It does not forget, it delays. I folded the speech back into its folder with the same care it had been given. And as I did, I wondered how many moments like this lie hidden in the archives, attempts at truth that simply arrived too early. This wasn't conspiracy. It wasn't suppression. It was something more subtle. The belief that some truths must wait for a world that's finally ready to hear them. Until then, they wait in silence, still breathing between the lines. There is a corridor in the deepest section of the archive that feels more like a boundary than a hallway. Its shelves are narrower, its walls unadorned, and its temperature more carefully controlled. Inside it are not the famous documents, the ones cited by historians or debated in universities, but something quieter: indexes, long, meticulous lists cataloging the contents of locked vaults deeper still, some of which require personal authorization from the highest levels of the curia. These indexes are cold in their precision. They read like inventories of kingdoms, folios numbered, entries marked with dates, languages, storage temperatures. But reading between the lines, I came to see them for what they really are: a map of the Church's memory, stretching back over a millennium. And in these lists, you begin to understand how vast the unspoken truly is. One index in particular caught my eye. It was labeled Memorabilia Res Privatae, and beneath that, in elegant script, filed items of no current ecclesial relevance. A strange phrase. What could be so carefully preserved, yet declared irrelevant? The entries ranged from obscure royal correspondences to disputed relic transfers, but every so often, a line would appear with no page reference, no access record, just a title. One read, "Petition from unnamed cleric, 1859. Another, "Account of unapproved Marian apparition, Ireland, 1877. No links, no summaries, just echoes. Most haunting of all were the redacted entries. In the center of the page, line after line had been neatly blacked out, not sloppily, but with deliberate strokes. Next to them were small notations: removed, reclassified, pending reassessment. The Vatican does not destroy its past, but it does move it. Folders vanish from one room and appear in another under different names. Documents are reboxed, retitled, stored deeper. They are not erased. They are simply placed further out of reach. One entry bore a small triangle beside it, a symbol I'd never seen before. It read, "The correspondence of Pius IX with unnamed foreign agent, seal unbroken." The seal had never been opened. That meant the contents had never been officially read, never copied, never discussed. A letter that had waited for more than a century, untouched. It raised a question that has never left me. What do we preserve if we are not willing to read it? What is the purpose of keeping knowledge in a place where it is destined never to be understood? The archive is not just a collection of secrets. It is an architecture of intention, a place where memory is managed not by what is revealed, but by how it is arranged. And if truth is a light, then this section is not darkness. It is a kind of fog, dense, deliberate, and always just out of reach. Not all mysteries in the archive are grand or dramatic. Some are quiet, so quiet that they seem to have been forgotten, even by those who preserved them. I once came across a thin folder stored in the wrong section, tucked between files on diocesan finances and historical population censuses. Its binding was brittle, the label barely legible. Michelangelis, Epistolae Privatae. It wasn't until I opened it that I realized what I had found. Inside were personal letters, handwritten, emotional, and entirely unrecorded in any published history, attributed to Michelangelo Buonarroti. These weren't artistic treatises or philosophical musings. They were pleas, letters sent directly to the Vatican, written late in his life, imploring that his final sculpture, the Rondanini Pietà, not be altered or hidden after his death. In the letters, Michelangelo described the sculpture not as a commission, but as a confession. He wrote that his aging hands could no longer carve with the same clarity, but that in the rough stone and strange proportions of the Pietà, he had finally expressed his own grief, his understanding of death, of faith, of redemption. One passage struck me like a sudden breath of wind. "If this work is not understood," he wrote, "then I accept it, but let it remain untouched. Let it fail in its truth, not succeed in someone else's." There was no record that the Vatican ever replied, but attached to the final letter was a Vatican note, unsigned, addressed to a committee responsible for sacred art. It suggested that the Pietà's form might cause confusion, that its depiction of Christ and Mary, elongated, strange, fused in sorrow, was not in keeping with the uplifting aesthetic traditionally preferred. The note proposed either its removal from public view or its storage within a non-devotional context. Essentially, the Church acknowledged its discomfort and chose quiet removal over confrontation. And yet, the sculpture survives. It now stands in Milan, open to the public, though rarely contextualized as Michelangelo intended. The letters, as far as I know, have never been exhibited, quoted, or included in major collections of his work. But in that quiet folder, they endure. A private act of honesty from one of the greatest minds of the Renaissance, preserved by the very institution that once considered setting it aside. It made me wonder how many artists, saints, thinkers, and prophets have written to the Church, not to request permission, but to offer a truth too vulnerable to fit the canon. And how many of those voices still wait, unopened, between pages marked irrelevant or awaiting review, in a vault that remembers more than it reveals. Some folders in the Vatican archive carry no name at all, just symbols. I found one such item stored in a drawer labeled only with the Roman numeral Ing and a faded circle drawn in black ink. Inside was a manuscript unlike anything I'd seen elsewhere in the collection. It wasn't dated, nor was it signed. The pages were thin, inked in a style that suggested late 19th century, and bound loosely with string. Its contents were theological, but in a way that felt personal. An extended meditation on a single idea. What happens when a confession is too dangerous to forgive? The author, possibly a theologian or confessor, had structured the text as a series of imagined dialogues between a penitent and a priest. But these weren't typical confessions. The sins described were not moral failings, but acts of truth, truths that violated church order, exposed corruption, or risked scandal. One penitent claimed to have uncovered evidence of forged canonizations. Another admitted to hiding a forbidden text copied from an ancient Gnostic scroll. A third spoke of visions so disturbing they were advised never to speak of them again. Each time the priest responds not with forgiveness, but with caution. He says, "This is not for absolution. This is for safekeeping." That phrase appears again and again throughout the manuscript, not for absolution, for safekeeping, as though the author was wrestling with the idea that some truths are too dangerous to be released through grace, that there must be a place, even in heaven's ledger, for secrets too complex to reconcile. Was this a work of fiction, a philosophical exercise, or was it something more, an encoded record of real conversations that had no place in official sacramental archives? I couldn't say. The Vatican had placed no stamp of authenticity or approval on the document, yet it had preserved it. Carefully, deliberately, someone believed it mattered. What struck me most was the final page. The dialogue ends abruptly, but beneath it, a single sentence is written in red. God knows, but we are the ones who must live with knowing. That line didn't read like doctrine. It read like exhaustion, like someone who had carried too many confessions that had no answer. And as I placed the pages back in their folder, I realized something. The Church has always wrestled with what cannot be spoken from the pulpit. The archive is its second confessional, not for sins to be forgiven, but for truths to be held in trust, kept not for the sake of secrecy, but because some burdens are too sacred and too unbearable to be released all at once. In one of the smaller reading rooms, lined with narrow windows and cabinets locked by brass keys, I came across a set of documents catalogued under the term Indici Temporanei, temporary indices. At first glance, they seemed harmless enough, just brief inventories of books and materials that had once been under consideration for placement in the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's infamous list of banned books. But as I turned the pages, I realized these weren't just records of suppression. They were snapshots of fear. Fear not of fiction, but of fact. The books in these listings were not always heretical, nor obscene. Many were scientific, political, or simply speculative. They had not been banned officially, but neither had they been approved. They were suspended in a kind of theological purgatory, not erased, not accepted, simply left waiting in the shadows. One entry referred to a book on astronomy written by a Polish Jesuit in the 1700s. The author attempted to reconcile early scientific theories with the Genesis creation narrative, proposing that days in the Bible might be metaphorical rather than literal. His conclusion was not heresy, but uncertainty. He asked questions. He offered room for ambiguity. The response from church officials was swift, to be reviewed under quieter circumstances. The book was pulled from circulation, never banned, but quietly lost to time. The phrase quieter circumstances appears repeatedly in these indices, like a bell that tolls behind closed doors. Another folder held a list of titles never published, books written by priests, monks, and even bishops shelved indefinitely by internal committees for reasons as vague as too speculative or too sympathetic to the Protestant perspective. Some of these manuscripts had been submitted with personal letters, pleading for consideration, noting decades of study or pastoral experience. A few were accompanied by handwritten notes in the margins from reviewers who seemed moved by the arguments but unwilling to risk endorsement. Brilliant, one reviewer wrote, but untimely. That word, untimely, was used like a blade. Not a rejection of truth, but a postponement of its arrival. These weren't the works of radicals. They were the voices of insiders trying to push gently at the edges of understanding, and the Vatican, unwilling to condemn them outright, simply filed them away. The result is a bookshelf that doesn't exist, an invisible library of thoughts that asked too much, too soon. And perhaps, one day, those questions will no longer be dangerous. But until then, they sleep in drawers marked not by condemnation, but by caution, waiting for the noise of history to subside. There's a cabinet in one of the inner chambers that doesn't seem remarkable at first glance. Small, metal, with a dent in the side and no visible markings. It's the kind of storage unit you'd expect to find in a school archive or a modest library, not in the vaults of the Vatican. And yet, inside that cabinet, I found one of the most quietly devastating collections in the entire archive, reports of miracles that were never approved. These weren't false claims or charlatanism. They were serious submissions, testimonies from clergy and lay people, sometimes supported by witnesses, sometimes even investigated by diocesan authorities. But something about them proved too unsettling, too difficult to explain, or simply too inconvenient for the Church to embrace. The process of evaluating a miracle is long and complex. It requires evidence, consistency, theological coherence, and most of all, timing. If a claimed miracle doesn't align with what the Church is ready to recognize, it isn't necessarily denounced. It's set aside. And in this cabinet, I found miracles that had been waiting, some for decades, others for centuries. One folder contained a case from rural Spain in the early 1800s, in which a woman reportedly cured a dying child after a visitation from what she described as a sorrowful figure bearing no name, only light. The child lived. Local clergy documented the case carefully, but when the account reached Rome, the response was swift. No canonical framework for such an apparition. Case closed. Another report came from an African missionary station in 1927. A group of villagers claimed that during a drought, a priest had led a procession carrying a relic said to belong to a little-known saint. Rain fell that same night, and not just in that village, but in surrounding regions. The priest submitted his report reluctantly, noting that he feared it would not be received well. His fear proved correct. The miracle was deemed culturally influenced and shelved. What united all these cases wasn't fraud or contradiction. It was discomfort. The miracles didn't fit the expectations of Rome. They didn't follow familiar patterns or occur in familiar places. And rather than risk confusion, the Church chose to remain silent. But it did not throw them away. That is what haunted me most. The Vatican does not discard wonder. It preserves it, quietly, cautiously, and always behind a lock. Not because it isn't true, but because it might be, and perhaps, someday, the world will be ready to believe in something that still defies explanation, even inside the walls of the most carefully guarded faith on earth. Among the documents that disturbed me most, not for their violence but for their quiet, was a series of hand-copied reports from the 14th century. Pages that appeared in a section labeled Tempore Pestis, the time of the plague. These were records of letters sent from isolated parishes during the Black Death, written by priests, monks, and nuns who found themselves surrounded by death on a scale they could neither explain nor contain. They were addressed not to Rome but to God, copied and archived as if someone had decided even unanswered prayers should be preserved. Most of the letters described familiar things, mass burials, collapsed communities, dying clergy. But one, written in 1348, stood out. It came from a small monastery in the French countryside. The scribe wrote, "We cannot absolve the dying fast enough. There are no last rites, only last breaths." He described how each morning the survivors would gather at the chapel steps and draw names from a bowl to decide who would carry the bodies to the pit. "We fear death," he wrote, "but more than that, we fear the silence of heaven." That line stayed with me, because what these documents revealed was not just the terror of the plague, but the spiritual loneliness it left behind. One of the most chilling entries was a short, unsigned account from a town near Avignon. It recounted a day when over 30 children were found abandoned near the cathedral steps, their families gone, their names unknown. The local bishop wrote to Rome asking what should be done. No reply is recorded, but in the margins of the letter, someone later wrote in a smaller hand, "They were taken in, 2 survived." That was it. No names, no follow-up, just a faint note that someone, somewhere, had tried to care. The archive holds these letters with surprising reverence. They're wrapped in linen, bound in leather, as though someone long ago understood they were more than historical artifacts. They were confessions of a church struggling to keep its humanity while drowning in suffering. There are no theological declarations in these files, no pronouncements from popes, just raw, handwritten grief. We like to imagine that in times of crisis, faith brings clarity. But the truth these letters show is more complicated. In plague years, faith was often held in trembling hands. It didn't offer certainty. It offered the only thing people could cling to when certainty vanished, a hope that even if heaven was silent, someone, somewhere, would still remember what they endured. One drawer in the far end of the archive had no label, just a small brass plate where a nameplate had once been pried away. The key I used clicked with resistance, and inside were folders wrapped not in linen or ribbon, but in thin strips of black cloth. There were only 5. They were stored side by side, like books in mourning. The handwriting on the first folder was unusually delicate, and across the top it read, De Prophetia non canonizzata, of the uncanonized prophecies. These were not prophecies the Church had declared false, but ones it had chosen never to recognize at all. Some came from the early centuries, submitted by desert hermits and monks living in seclusion. Others were more recent, anonymous visions recorded during times of upheaval, war, or reform. What they all shared was a sense of urgency, of being spoken by someone who believed they had been given a glimpse of something true and terrible. One parchment dated 1847 described a vision of metal birds circling over cities that burned in silence. A detail that startled me, not for its accuracy, but for how plainly it had been filed away long before such things existed. Another from 1931 warned of a leader with no crown but millions of voices. These were not detailed blueprints of the future, but metaphors, symbols of deep unease, sometimes poetry, sometimes warning. The most unsettling vision I read was a short one, no more than a few lines. It came from a cloistered nun in northern Italy and had been submitted by her confessor. The stones will speak, she wrote, and those who forget will hear them. She claimed she had seen churches collapse from within, not by fire, but by memory returning. Her prophecy was never investigated. In the margin, someone had written, "Too metaphorical, unstable." And so it was shelved. The Church has long walked a careful line with prophecy. Canonized visions, like those at Fatima or Lourdes, are embraced when they reinforce doctrine, when they provide comfort or inspire renewal. But the archive reveals a different side. Visions that disturb, that suggest internal failures or future reckonings are often set aside, not discredited, just unrecognized. The Vatican doesn't destroy them. It keeps them, quietly, perhaps in case they one day prove true. These folders do not offer certainty. They don't predict the end of days. But they suggest that within the heart of the Church there has always been an ear pressed closely to the unknown. And sometimes what is heard is too frightening to share, so it is stored, preserved in shadow, waiting for the world to understand the voice behind it. Not every secret in the Vatican is hidden inside a drawer. Some are folded, handwritten, and kept loose in envelopes with no clear destination. I once came across a plain envelope marked with a single phrase, ad quem non dicitur, to whom it is not addressed. Inside was a single page of uneven script, written in Italian, unsigned, and clearly never delivered. It wasn't a letter, it was a prayer, but not like the ones found in missals or chanted from pulpits. This was a prayer of disillusionment, raw, personal, and filled with spiritual exhaustion. It opened with a line that was both confession and lament. I no longer know who I speak to when I kneel. The writer described years spent in silence, watching as decisions were made behind closed doors, watching as those with power clung to appearance over truth. They spoke not of heresy or doubt, but of something harder to name, the gradual erosion of clarity in a world where the Church no longer seemed able to speak plainly. We dress our answers in robes and incense, the page read, but behind them, I hear only delay. This wasn't a protest. It wasn't angry. It was mournful. A final paragraph pleaded not for reform, but for acknowledgement. If we have failed to be holy, let us at least be honest. Holiness will return when we stop pretending it never left. There was no response in the file, no record of who wrote it, no recipient, no comment, and yet the Vatican had chosen to keep it. Why would a single page of despair be preserved in a system so meticulous and so deeply invested in continuity? That question stayed with me. Perhaps someone believed that even unspoken prayers should be remembered. Or perhaps the Vatican understands something most of us forget, that the failures of faith, when recorded honestly, are not weaknesses. They are proof of sincerity. This document didn't rewrite any doctrine. It didn't reveal conspiracy or controversy. But in its simplicity, it told the truth about what happens when belief is buried under bureaucracy, when words meant to heal become strategies, and when a heart, still faithful, begins to wonder if heaven is still listening. Not all prayers reach the altar. Some are tucked away, too broken to be recited aloud, too human to discard. And in the Vatican archive, they remain, not because they were powerful, but because they were true. And because one day, someone may need to hear that they weren't alone in wondering what silence really means. In a narrow hall rarely visited, I came upon a wooden chest so worn it looked like it belonged in a farmhouse rather than in the heart of the Vatican. There was no gold, no carvings, just a small iron lock and a handwritten tag that read, Memoranda interna, Concilia non celebrata, which translates to internal memoranda, councils not held. Inside was a quiet archive of what could have been drafts, notes, and proposals for major church councils that were planned but never convened. These weren't public announcements. They were internal blueprints for moments of reform, reconciliation, or response that were quietly abandoned before they ever reached the world. One set of documents detailed plans for a council to be held in the early 1700s, intended to address the growing divide between emerging scientific ideas and church orthodoxy. The tone of the drafts was careful, hopeful even. One cardinal wrote that, "We must not fear the movement of the stars, but learn to see the heavens as the language of God." The proposed agenda included the integration of astronomical findings into theological education and an acknowledgement that certain scriptural interpretations might need updating. But nothing came of it. The council was postponed, and eventually it was forgotten. In the margins of the final draft, someone wrote, "Perhaps the time will be right after another century." Another folder held notes for a council to be held in the 1930s. This one focused on the rise of political extremism and the Church's relationship with authoritarian regimes. The organizers feared that aligning too closely with any one state would compromise the universality of the Church. They proposed a declaration denouncing political absolutism, urging Catholics to remain loyal to conscience rather than government. But the council never took place. The world moved too quickly. War arrived, and the silence remained. These ghost councils speak volumes not through what they accomplished, but through what they didn't. Each one was an attempt to confront something looming: intellectual shifts, political threats, moral reckonings. And each time, the Vatican hesitated, not because it didn't care, but because it feared what a full confrontation might require. Doctrine must move slowly, power even more so. The chest held no declarations, no final decisions, just possibilities suspended in time. A record of the moments when change stood knocking and was told to come back later. And perhaps it still waits, just beyond the walls, wondering whether the Church will one day answer, or whether it has grown too accustomed to the comfort of delay. Near the oldest part of the archive, where the temperature is kept a few degrees cooler and the air smells faintly of parchment and dust, there is a shelf marked only with the Roman numeral 3. It holds a series of leather-bound ledgers so uniform they appear almost artificial, as though copied to exacting standards. But they are real, and within them is one of the least understood but most revealing categories of Vatican record-keeping: dossiers on silence. These are files not about events that happened, but about decisions not to speak, not to act, not to intervene. The Church has always known the power of speech, but here it becomes clear that silence is its own kind of language. Each ledger page contains an entry that begins with a date, a location, and a brief description of the issue at hand. Then follows a summary of deliberations that ends with a phrase repeated again and again. No pronouncement will be made at this time. These weren't neglectful absences. They were deliberate pauses, considered silences. One file from 1871 recounts a Vatican commission debating whether to address growing reports of abuse within a certain European religious order. The evidence was noted, witnesses described, but the final entry reads, "To proceed risks greater scandal than to delay. The matter is to be reviewed quietly in due course." There is no further mention. The same volume contains decisions regarding colonial violence, the treatment of indigenous converts, and later, the Church's position on authoritarian leaders. In each, silence is weighed against exposure, and silence is chosen. The ledgers do not read like conspiracies. They read like caution layered over uncertainty. The justifications vary: protecting the faithful, avoiding political entanglement, preserving theological unity. But the outcome is the same: public silence, private record. The Vatican does not erase these choices. It records them, file by file, like a confessional for its own hesitations. Perhaps the most heartbreaking entry comes from 1943, when reports of deportations in Italy were rising. A short note, unsigned, reads, "There is knowledge, there is no voice. We pray, but we do not speak." That line stayed with me long after I closed the ledger. It revealed something we rarely admit, that silence is not always the absence of knowledge. Sometimes it is its burden. These files aren't damning because they expose evil. They're haunting because they expose fear. The fear of fracture, of consequence, of unintended truths. And in recording these silences so carefully, the Vatican confirms what it cannot say aloud, that sometimes the loudest sound in the room is the one never made. Deep within the restricted wing, I encountered a cabinet far newer than the rest. Unlike the ancient drawers of brittle parchment, this one was sleek, metallic, and locked by a modern digital mechanism. I only accessed it once, and only because a senior archivist left it open while cataloging a related entry. Inside were folders marked "Pending Sanctification," files on individuals considered for sainthood who never made it beyond the earliest stages. Most names I didn't recognize. A few I did, faintly, from obscure footnotes in Catholic histories. But what struck me wasn't who they were, it was why their causes had stalled. The canonization process is long and painstaking. It requires not just evidence of a holy life, but also proof of miracles, doctrinal alignment, and the absence of scandal. The files in this drawer revealed men and women whose lives were devout, even heroic. yet whose legacies were too politically complicated, too ideologically risky, or simply too inconvenient. One was a bishop who risked his life hiding refugees during the war, only to later criticize Vatican diplomacy in private letters. Another was a mystic from the 1920s whose visions encouraged interfaith dialogue long before the church was ready. In the notes beside her file, someone had written, "Beloved locally, theologically premature." One entry struck me deeply. It concerned a laywoman in Latin America who organized underground networks to protect children from forced conscription during a civil conflict. Her acts were bold and selfless, and several bishops supported her cause. But her writings, filled with rage against corruption, both political and religious, proved too sharp for formal recognition. Her sanctity, the file read, is eclipsed by her tone, and so she remains uncanonized, her story stored in a metal drawer behind electronic locks. What these files showed was that holiness alone is not enough to become a saint. Timing matters. Politics matters. The comfort level of the hierarchy matters. And in that realization lies something deeply human and deeply unsettling. The saints we venerate are often mirrors of what the Church is willing to celebrate in a given age. But these uncanonized lives speak to another kind of virtue, one less polished, one less palatable, but no less real. They are not forgotten. Their names are just waiting for a generation brave enough to recognize that the measure of sanctity is not conformity, but courage, and that sometimes the holiest voices are the ones too honest to be crowned. Among the oldest and most fragile sections of the Vatican archives lies a quiet, dust-thick alcove where only a few lanterns offer a faint glow. There, on a shelf close to the floor, I once found a box labeled simply Acta Suspensa, Suspended Acts. It held no dramatic secrets, no wars or heresies, just decisions never finalized, dozens of them. Proposals, decrees, and drafts written over centuries, each paused mid-thought by a hesitation that outlived its authors. I found papal briefs with no seals, edicts with signatures missing, even theological statements with whole sections blacked out in careful ink. It was like holding a breath that never got released. One folder dated 1623 outlined a decree meant to formally apologize for the execution of Giordano Bruno. The draft was clear, even heartfelt in its tone. Though judged heretical by the laws of his day, the man's inquiry was sincere, and for that we grieve. But at the bottom was a red line drawn across the page with a note: "Do not publish. Await further deliberation." There was no follow-up. Nothing ever came of it. Another case from 1892 detailed the beginnings of a papal condemnation of race-based pseudoscience, which was gaining traction in Europe at the time. The draft included a firm rebuke of theories that treated any human population as inherently inferior. It quoted scripture, emphasized divine equality, and included input from missionaries in Africa and Asia. But again, the declaration was never issued. The margin bore a single caution: may be interpreted politically. What these suspended acts reveal is a side of the Church rarely seen in public: the inner conflict, the struggle between the will to speak and the fear of consequence. These were not failures of faith. They were failures of timing, of confidence, of unity. The Church often presents itself as steady and unwavering, but here you see its tremors, its paused intentions. Some of these decisions may still come to light, others are now irrelevant, but all of them bear the imprint of minds torn between conviction and constraint. They are not buried, just suspended, like lanterns unlit in the dark, waiting for a hand brave enough to strike the flame. It is easy to believe that history moves in finished acts, but the Vatican's suspended archives show a different truth, that some choices are left dangling not out of indecision, but out of fear that to choose at all might bring down everything the silence was trying to hold together. There is a section of the archive not marked on most maps. It lies just behind a room dedicated to diplomatic correspondence, through a passage that once served as a servants' corridor in the old apostolic palace. The air there is still and slightly metallic, as if time itself had condensed. Inside, preserved in temperature-controlled cabinets, is one of the most curious and least discussed collections in the Vatican, the Archive of Unacknowledged Phenomena. That is not the official name, of course. The label reads simply Eventa Extraordinaria, or Extraordinary Events. It houses reports from across the globe describing visions, apparitions, and inexplicable events submitted to the Vatican from the early 17th century to the present day. Not all of them are religious in nature. Some are claims of miraculous healings, yes, but others are stranger still. Glowing lights over monasteries, spectral voices heard by entire congregations, even records of priests who claimed prophetic dreams that matched future events. These documents are not sensational. In fact, they are unusually clinical. Written by clergy, bishops, and sometimes lay people, they are almost obsessively precise. Dates, locations, witnesses, symptoms, and in most cases, the conclusion is the same: further investigation unnecessary at this time. In other words, quietly filed away. One of the oldest reports, from 1678, describes a small village in Sicily where a series of identical dreams was reported among parishioners over the course of 7 weeks. Each dream involved a figure in crimson robes weeping before a burning manuscript. The bishop at the time requested an investigation, but a Vatican note later advised pastoral discretion, and the event faded from history. Another file from the 1950s recounts how 3 nuns in Brazil claimed to have received an identical message from a vision during prayer, urging the church to prepare for the unraveling of boundaries. That phrase is underlined in the document with a question mark beside it. None of these events were ever declared heretical, nor were they embraced. They were held in a state of quiet ambiguity, neither accepted nor denied. And perhaps that's what makes them so compelling. In a church that speaks in certainties, this small archive whispers doubt, wonder, and the discomfort of the unexplained. No grand declarations, no public miracles, just moments. Quiet, persistent moments that defy simple categorization. And in the end, maybe that's why they remain hidden. Not because they are false, but because they are too strange to fit inside the Church's careful language of clarity. Some mysteries, it seems, are safer left unopened. In one of the more fortified alcoves of the archives, a place where you have to pass through 2 locked gates and wear gloves to handle anything, sits a series of meticulously organized drawers titled Index Librorum Prohibitorum. These are the Vatican's records on books once banned for being dangerous to the faith, a catalog that began in the 16th century and wasn't officially abolished until 1966. Most people have heard of it in passing, but few realize the scope of what was actually collected, reviewed, and in some cases, quietly preserved even after condemnation. The Church may have banned these books from being read publicly, but here, behind layers of iron and protocol, they are all still waiting on the shelves. The original intent of the index was control, not of knowledge itself, but of interpretation. The Church feared that certain texts might lead the faithful astray, especially in eras of reform, revolution, and scientific challenge. But the files reveal a far more complex relationship. Each entry in the archive includes not only the title and author, but also a full rationale for its ban, and, in some cases, letters of protest from theologians or clergy who argued for their defense. I remember one folder in particular. It concerned a manuscript written by a Jesuit in the 1700s exploring the possibility of intelligent life beyond Earth. It was theological speculation, not science fiction, but it raised profound questions about original sin, salvation, and the uniqueness of Christ's incarnation. The Church's response was swift. The book was banned for introducing disruptive cosmology. But the Jesuit's letter to the Vatican was preserved alongside it. He wrote, "If our God is infinite, why should his creation not be?" His words were calm, faithful, and bold, and then silence. The manuscript was shelved. The man was reassigned. The debate vanished. Other banned works include treatises on democracy, feminist theology, even early calls for interreligious dialogue. Not all were heretical in content. Many were simply inconvenient, a threat to unity, a challenge to hierarchy. In a room that professes to keep dangerous ideas away from the world, it is ironic that those same ideas were catalogued, archived, and kept with such care. The index no longer guides Catholic practice, but its shadow remains. These books, once feared, are now relics, not of sin, but of struggle. They remind us that faith and fear often walk together, and that sometimes the most sacred libraries are built not to hide knowledge, but to hold the tension of what cannot yet be resolved. Within the vast expanse of the Vatican archives, there lies a compartment filled with correspondence that reveals an unlikely chapter of diplomacy. These letters, exchanged during the tumultuous 19th century, document the Vatican's secret communications with one of the most enigmatic and isolated empires of that era, the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan. At a time when Christianity was banned and its followers persecuted within Japan, the Vatican maintained a discreet line of contact, routed through Portuguese missionaries and merchants, hidden inside wooden statues and coded missives. One letter, dated 1611, caught my attention most. It was an official response from the Tokugawa court, addressed respectfully to the Pope, and written in formal Portuguese. The message acknowledged the loyalty and knowledge brought by missionaries, but made clear the shogunate's rejection of a faith that divides families and sows discord. Yet despite the outright refusal, the tone was diplomatic, almost respectful, a recognition of the Church's spiritual authority alongside a firm stance on social order. Alongside that letter was an undelivered Vatican draft. It expressed hope for dialogue, emphasized shared values like discipline and reverence, and sought a peaceful coexistence. But scribbled at the bottom was a terse note: no reply, too risky. It was a stark reminder of the delicate balance the Church tried to maintain between spreading faith and respecting sovereign power. These letters were never meant for public eyes. They were documents of tentative diplomacy, bridging worlds that seldom spoke, let alone understood each other. The Vatican preserved them not as trophies of triumph, but as reminders of limits, the fragile threads of communication that spanned continents and cultures, constrained by fear and respect. In an empire that closed its doors and suppressed a religion, the Church quietly listened, waited, and recorded. These hidden exchanges tell a story of patience and restraint, of faith tempered by politics. They reveal that even the most powerful religious institution sometimes must bow to the realities of earthly rule, choosing silence over confrontation. And in the quiet preservation of these letters, the Vatican archives hold a testament to faith's long, complex dance with power and its limits. In the hushed corridors of the archive, I once came across a dossier marked only by the simple phrase, Inquisition Files. The weight of that label was immediately palpable. These records, painstakingly preserved over centuries, contain transcripts, verdicts, and correspondences detailing one of the most feared institutions in Church history. The Inquisition's purpose was to protect doctrine, But these documents reveal the profound human conflicts beneath that mission, debates about justice, mercy, and the cost of faith. One case stood out among many. Giordano Bruno, a philosopher burned at the stake in 1600. His trial records are detailed and harrowing, but a single note from one of his inquisitors caught my eye. It said, "If we spare him, doctrine will waver. If we burn him, history will not forgive." This admission of agonizing doubt was a rare glimpse into the hearts of those who wielded power. It was not blind zealotry, but a fear of losing control, fear of truth, fear of chaos. The documents also reveal the internal conflicts within the Church. Some clergy argued for clemency, believing Bruno's ideas were radical but not heretical. Others pressed for harsh punishment to deter dissent. The transcripts include pleas for reconsideration, heated exchanges over theological nuance, and moments of silence heavy with uncertainty. The Inquisition was not a monolith, but a battleground of conscience and doctrine. Beyond the trials, there are records of those accused but later acquitted, and testimonies revealing the everyday fears of communities caught in religious and political turmoil. These files do not glorify the past, nor excuse its violence. Instead, they offer a solemn archive of struggle between faith and knowledge, authority and freedom. Holding those pages, I realized the Inquisition was not just about suppression. It was about the Church wrestling with its own limits, questioning where belief ends and control begins. The archives don't offer easy answers, but they do offer truth, that history is complicated, painful, and often unresolved. And in that unresolved space, the Vatican keeps its memories, waiting for those patient enough to read, understand, and remember. There is a particular drawer in the Vatican archives where the air feels heavy with stories whispered rather than spoken aloud. Inside are dossiers labeled Papal Correspondence, Private, documents that belonged not to the public church, but to the Pope alone. These letters and notes reveal a side of the pontiffs rarely seen, their fears, doubts, and moments of profound loneliness amid the weight of spiritual and political power. They are personal, often unsent, and sometimes written in coded language. One letter, penned by Pope Gregory XV in the early 17th century, expressed concern about the growing tensions between secular rulers and the Church. He wrote of sleepless nights and the burden of choosing between peace and principle. The letter was never sent, perhaps because it revealed a vulnerability the papacy preferred to keep hidden. Another note by Pius X reflected on the loss of the Papal States and the loneliness of spiritual exile, the sense of being a king without a kingdom. These personal writings humanize figures often seen as distant or infallible. What struck me most was a journal entry by Pope Pius XII during World War II. In it, he described the agony of silence amid atrocity, wrestling with the limits of intervention and the fear of worsening persecution. His words were cautious but honest. "I carry the prayers of millions, but also the weight of unspoken sorrow." It was a rare glimpse into the internal conflict faced by a man whose decisions affected millions, yet who remained profoundly alone in his choices. These private archives remind us that the Vatican is not only an institution of power, but also a place where human frailty persists. Popes are more than symbols. They are men burdened by responsibility and doubt. The letters and diaries stored here are testimonies to that reality, preserved behind locked doors, so that history might remember not only what was commanded, but what was quietly endured. One of the more visually striking sections of the Vatican archives is dedicated to art, specifically to plans, sketches, and correspondences about major projects commissioned by the Church over the centuries. Among these are preliminary drawings by renowned artists like Bernini, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Yet tucked away in a seldom visited cabinet, I discovered a series of designs never realized, proposals for altarpieces and sculptures that were quietly shelved, often for reasons that reveal much about the Church's relationship with art and politics. One set of drawings, attributed to Bernini's workshop, depicted a grandiose altar meant for a chapel in St. Peter's Basilica. The plans were intricate and beautiful, yet the altar was never built. The correspondence attached to the sketches revealed opposition from a faction of cardinals who worried the design was too theatrical, too extravagant, potentially distracting from the solemnity of worship. The conflict was not merely artistic, it was a battle over how faith should be visually expressed, between grandeur and restraint, between spectacle and silence. Another folder contained sketches of frescoes commissioned during the Counter-Reformation but abandoned mid-project. These artworks were intended to convey church doctrine through vivid biblical scenes. Yet letters from the Vatican expressed concern that some depictions might inspire fear rather than faith, or worse, confusion among the illiterate. So the artists were ordered to modify their work or cease entirely. The unfinished frescoes were packed away, leaving blank walls that remain to this day. What these archives reveal is a church deeply invested not only in the content of faith but in its presentation. Artistic projects could be halted by theological worries, political rivalries, or shifts in papal priorities. The silence surrounding these works speaks to a cautious institution, one that understands the power of images, but fears the power of misinterpretation. In preserving these sketches and letters, the Vatican keeps not only art, but the story of faith's negotiation with culture and power. These lost masterpieces are echoes of dreams deferred, reminders that the Church's history is as much about what was never shown as what was displayed. And in those shadows, we find a deeper understanding of faith's fragile dialogue with expression. There is a strict and almost reverent avoidance of modernity in many parts of the Vatican archives. This is not only a matter of preservation, but a statement about the institution itself. I learned early on that no records include references to modern technology or current cultural phenomena. You won't find documents speaking of electricity, radio broadcasts, or digital communications. The Church's memory stops at a threshold, deliberately maintained to keep the past distinct and untainted by what it views as transient or profane. One striking example is the careful absence of any mention of the First Vatican Council's reactions to the Industrial Revolution. While surrounding European intellectuals grappled openly with the implications of mechanization and urbanization, the Church's official records remain silent or evasive. Instead, dossiers focus on pastoral responses, encouraging faith in a changing world, without engaging with the specific technological shifts. It's a silence that speaks volumes, suggesting a deliberate boundary drawn between eternal truths and temporary change. Even in more recent archives, references to technologies such as television, computers, or the internet are conspicuously absent. Reports on communication strategies focus on traditional methods, sermons, printed pamphlets, radio in some cases, but always with a cautionary note. The Church seems to preserve its sacred heritage by excluding the rapid, unpredictable march of modern media from its official narrative. This exclusion is not ignorance, but intentional. It reflects a worldview that values continuity and spiritual constancy over the flux of innovation. The Church guards its identity by carefully managing what enters its historical record and what remains outside. Modernity, in this sense, is treated almost as an intrusion, an element kept at arm's length to protect the Church's eternal message. The Vatican Archive is, in this way, a curated memory designed to remind us that the Church is not just an institution rooted in time, but one that seeks to transcend it. This creates a paradox. By shielding itself from the new, it preserves a sense of sacred timelessness, but it also risks isolation. And within that tension lies the story of an institution constantly balancing tradition against transformation, preservation against progress. Among the many rooms within the Vatican archives, there is one dedicated to the histories of individuals who began their journey within the Church's fold, but whose paths diverged from the expected. I found files chronicling the lives of pages, young boys taken into service to be trained in ecclesiastical duties, often from tender ages as young as 7. Their lives were meant to be steeped in faith, discipline, and loyalty. Yet these documents tell stories far more complex. Stories of isolation, harsh expectation, and the struggle to reconcile childhood with the weight of destiny. One volume contained letters written by a boy named Matteo, who entered the papal household with dreams of service, but soon found himself overwhelmed by the rigid structure and the loneliness of his existence. In his letters, Matteo spoke of missing his family, the coldness of the marble halls, and the pressure to conform to a life that left little room for play or personal doubt. His writing matured quickly, reflecting the loss of innocence that accompanied his early training. The archives also preserve records of disciplinary actions, moments when boys were punished not for disobedience, but for failing to live up to the ideal of perfection expected of them. One report detailed a boy who was reprimanded for showing too much empathy toward a servant, an act considered a weakness in the eyes of his superiors. These entries are clinical but revealing, hinting at the emotional toll exacted on children raised in the shadow of absolute authority. Yet among the accounts, there are also moments of resilience, letters of encouragement from mentors, records of rare friendships forged in secrecy, and accounts of boys who found solace in scripture or music. These documents paint a picture not of uniform compliance, but of young souls grappling with duty, identity, and faith. The file on Matteo ends abruptly, his later life unrecorded. Whether he rose in the church ranks or quietly left, the archive offers no answer. But in these preserved fragments, we glimpse the hidden world of childhood behind the Vatican's grandeur, a world of dreams, struggles, and the silent shaping of futures that would touch history in ways both great and unseen. In one of the less traveled corridors of the archive, I came across a collection labeled simply Village Chronicles. These were handwritten accounts, letters, and reports sent from rural parishes across medieval Europe, places where the vast power of the Church met the stark realities of peasant life. The records were often humble, sometimes fragmented, but they offered a rare window into how faith was experienced far from Rome's grandeur. One letter from a French priest in the 14th century described the crushing hardship of famine and disease. He wrote of villagers who prayed ceaselessly, yet watched their children perish and their crops fail. The Church was their solace and their burden, a source of ritual comfort, but also a reminder of their suffering. The priest's words revealed a tension between hope and despair, between the promise of salvation and the cruelty of earthly existence. Another account from an English village told of a mysterious illness sweeping through the community. The priest detailed the desperate attempts to understand the plague's cause, the fear that it was a punishment from God, and the efforts to hold Mass and offer last rites amid the chaos. The entries grew darker with each passing page, chronicling not only physical death, but the fraying of social bonds and the rise of suspicion among neighbors. Yet, amid the hardship, there were moments of resilience. Records of harvest festivals, Saints' Day celebrations, and communal prayers showed how faith knit communities together even in the bleakest times. The church was both the center of daily life and a source of authority, guiding behavior, offering rites of passage, and providing structure in uncertainty. What struck me most was the sense that these chronicles were written not only for Rome, but for posterity, a way to ensure that the lives of the forgotten were remembered. The Vatican preserved them, not as grand narratives, but as fragments of lived experience. They remind us that history is not just the story of kings and popes, but of ordinary people whose faith and suffering shaped the Church itself. Among the countless boxes and folders, I found a collection labeled simply Knightly Orders. These archives told the stories not just of valor and battle, but of a harsh, often brutal reality behind the chivalric ideals. The lives of medieval knights, sworn to defend the faith and serve their lords, were far from the romantic tales we hear today. The documents revealed a world marked by violence, fear, and relentless duty. One set of letters detailed the grueling training of a young page, taken from his family at a tender age and sent to live in a castle. His days were filled with rigorous lessons in arms, horsemanship, and courtly behavior, but also long hours of menial labor, isolation, and harsh discipline. The letters he wrote back to his family spoke not of glory, but of exhaustion and loneliness. One passage read, "I am no longer a boy, but a tool fashioned for war. I have little time to dream." The archives also revealed the dangers knights faced, not just on the battlefield, but in daily life. There were reports of injuries from training accidents, illnesses contracted in damp castles, and the constant threat of betrayal in court politics. One knight's journal described a night when his own comrades turned on him over a dispute, forcing him to flee under cover of darkness. These records showed the fragile line between honor and survival. Yet amid the hardship, there were moments of camaraderie and faith. Chronicles recounted shared prayers before battle, the rituals that bound brothers in arms, and the sense of purpose that sustained them through hardship. The Church was deeply intertwined with the knightly identity, offering both spiritual guidance and political backing. Reading these documents, I realized that the image of the knight as a gallant hero is a gloss over a much grimmer truth. The Vatican archives preserve this more complicated legacy, the sacrifices, the suffering, and the human cost behind the sword and shield. It is a story of endurance as much as triumph, reminding us that history's heroes were often defined by their ability to bear burdens unseen by the crowds. In a quiet corner of the archives, I found a series of letters and petitions marked Victorian Era, documents that offer a stark contrast to the grandeur often associated with that time. These files chronicled the harsh realities faced by ordinary people under the weight of industrialization, poverty, and rapid social change. The Church's role during this era was complex, often torn between moral authority and political power, compassion and control. One letter from a parish priest in London described overcrowded slums where disease spread like wildfire. He wrote of families crammed into single rooms, children working long hours in factories, and the despair that filled the streets. His appeals to the Vatican were urgent, but received little immediate response. The Church, he lamented, was more focused on maintaining order and upholding doctrine than addressing these human crises. Another document detailed the rise of social reform movements, many of which the Church viewed with suspicion. Letters from bishops warned against the spread of secular ideas and socialism, seeing them as threats to faith and tradition. Yet within those warnings were acknowledgments of undeniable suffering. The Church operated schools and hospitals, but its aid was often conditional, tied to conformity and obedience. The archives also contained rare personal writings of laypeople, letters sent to clergy expressing doubt, fear, and a longing for spiritual solace amid hardship. Some described turning away from the church, feeling it had become distant and judgmental. Others spoke of finding strength in secret prayer or underground communities. Reading these pages, I realized the Victorian era was not just about progress and prosperity. It was also a time of deep struggle and spiritual questioning. The Church's archives preserve this tension, the gap between its ideals and the lived reality of millions. They remind us that faith is not static, but a living force that must confront the complexities of every age. And sometimes those complexities are harder to hold than the most ancient dogma. Among the countless correspondences in the archives, I came upon a series of documents labeled Plague Years. These were letters and reports sent by clergy during the devastation of the Black Death in the 14th century. They described a world unraveling, churches emptied, priests dying, entire communities succumbing to fear and despair. The church, normally a place of refuge and certainty, was overwhelmed by its own inability to offer answers. One letter from a rural parish in northern Italy detailed how the local priest struggled to administer last rites to the sick, often risking his own life. He wrote of the exhaustion and loneliness that came with endless funerals and the heartbreak of comforting families who had lost everyone. His words were raw and unpolished, a stark contrast to the lofty theology found elsewhere in the archives. Other reports revealed tensions within communities torn apart by suspicion. Some blamed Jews or other minorities for the plague, leading to violence and persecution. The church's official stance was cautious. Letters from bishops urged calm and charity, but often failed to quell the rising hysteria. In some cases, priests themselves expressed doubt and fear, questioning the meaning of suffering and the silence of God. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments of hope. Accounts of priests who stayed with their flocks, even when death seemed inevitable. Stories of hidden masses, communal prayers in secret, and acts of kindness that defied despair. These documents preserved not just the terror of the plague, but the resilience of faith. The archive's preservation of these letters serves as a reminder that faith is not a shield against suffering, but a companion through it. It reveals a church grappling with its limits, humanity laid bare in ink and parchment. And in those fragile pages, I saw a truth as relevant now as it was centuries ago, that in the face of darkness, faith endures not by denying pain, but by embracing it with courage and compassion. Among the many sealed chambers within the Vatican archives, there is one dedicated to records concerning colonial missions across Asia and Africa during the 19th century. These documents reveal a complicated relationship between faith and empire, where the Church's spiritual ambitions were entangled with political conquest and cultural upheaval. Letters, reports, and petitions in this section tell stories that are often at odds with the ideal of a universal church. One file contained correspondence from missionaries in Vietnam describing their struggles to maintain Christian communities under a hostile regime. They spoke of covert baptisms, secret schools, and the constant threat of persecution. But alongside these accounts were letters requesting support not only for spiritual needs, but also for political protection, urging the Vatican to intervene with colonial powers to secure safety and influence. The line between religious mission and political negotiation blurred repeatedly. Another set of documents came from Africa, where missionaries documented both the spread of Christianity and the brutal realities of colonial exploitation. Reports spoke of local resistance, forced conversions, and the use of faith as justification for control. Some missionaries protested these abuses, writing to Rome with pleas for reform and protection of indigenous peoples. Yet their voices were often muted in the official response, which favored maintaining alliances with colonial governments over addressing moral contradictions. These archives do not hide the Church's complicity, nor do they absolve it. Instead, they expose the tensions and contradictions at the heart of its global expansion. The Church was both a beacon of hope for many and an agent of cultural domination for others. The records show efforts to balance spiritual care with political realities, often at great ethical cost. Reading these documents, I was struck by the complexity of faith in the age of empire. The Vatican archive preserves not a single narrative, but a multitude of experiences, hope and oppression, conviction and compromise. It reminds us that history is never simple and that the legacy of faith is inseparable from the tangled web of power. At the very heart of the Vatican archives, beneath layers of dust and silence, I found a collection of personal memoirs written by caretakers, custodians, and lesser-known officials, those who lived within the walls but rarely appeared in history. Their accounts were not of grand theological debates or political maneuvers, but of daily life, quiet observations, and the weight of secrets carried in solitude. These voices, fragile and intimate, offered a final window into the Vatican's hidden world. One memoir described the loneliness of walking vast, empty corridors at night, with only the echo of footsteps and the faint scent of old parchment. The writer spoke of doors that were never opened, rooms that existed only in whispers, and the strange comfort found in being surrounded by centuries of unseen memory. There was a profound awareness that the archive was not just a place of knowledge, but of responsibility, a burden shared by few. Another caretaker reflected on the paradox of preserving faith and secrecy. He wrote about the tension between openness and protection, between the duty to safeguard truth and the fear that some truths could unravel the very foundations of belief. He confessed moments of doubt, of wonder, and of quiet hope that one day the archives might be approached not with suspicion, but with understanding. These memoirs revealed the human side of an institution often seen as monolithic and unyielding. The caretakers' stories were filled with humility and reverence, reminding me that behind the vast machinery of the Church are individuals bound by faith, curiosity, and conscience. They keep watch over history's shadows, not to hide the past, but to hold it gently until the world is ready. As I closed the final pages, I understood that the Vatican archives are more than a collection of secrets. They are a testament to the complexity of faith itself, its beauty and its burden, its light and its shadow. And in their quiet endurance, these stories invite us to listen, to question, and to remember that some truths are kept safe not to deceive, but to protect the fragile threads that connect us all.